Thank you again for joining us for the 2 days UKTR Bootcamp. And today we are in day 1, and here you should be able to see the agenda, the flow of the day. My name is Xiao. I'm working for the Timber Trade Federation on sustainability and responsible sourcing aspect with our members. And today I will be the facilitator for the event. So for the next 1 hour and a half, we will be joined by Soil Association. So Andy, Sam, and Sonia, who will go through with us the very fundamentals of UKTR and due diligence. We will then have a short break, and then at around 12 o'clock, Deanne from the UK Competent Authority, the Office of Product Safety and Standard, will be joining us to share about the current enforcement plan of UKTR in both the GB and Northern Ireland, and also a little bit on the latest activities involving Flag T. We will also have a Q&A session with Deanne, so hopefully we will be able to clarify all of our concerns and questions. In the afternoon, we will have a short group discussion and open discussion led by Andy and his team and colleagues here. And then Joanne from UPM will be joining us and share a little bit of her own experience with due diligence and how UPM is helping their UK clients meeting all the requirement and in terms of due diligence aspects. So that is the flow of the day. You should be able to use the chat or the Q&A functionalities. If you should be able to see the buttons somewhere on Zoom. Please do feel free to type your questions there, and then we will try to pick them up during the day. That's all from me for now. Thank you again. And then now I pass the floor to Andy. Thank you.
Thanks, Xiao. Hello, everybody. I'm just going to share screen. Is that all up and live now?
That works.
Okay, cool, there we are. So thanks everybody for attending this boot camp. I've not done a boot camp before, normally just webinars or training, so I need to be a little bit stricter with everybody, I think. So yeah, thanks very much. My name is Andy Grundy. I'm Senior Certification Manager with the Soil Association, and myself and a couple of colleagues, Sonia Nayar and Sam Shaw, are going to be with you for the next hour and a half, looking at various aspects of timber legality. So I'll start off by just describing who we are and why we know about it, and how we are authority on the subject. And then I'll start going right back to first principles, essentially what illegal logging is, and the origins of timber legality legislation worldwide, moving through to the EU timber regulation in particular, and then it's derived to UK timber regulation. I'll then hand over to Sonia, who will talk about due diligence system itself and the main kind of tenets of it, the collection of information, the assessment of risk, and the mitigation of any risk identified. Then we'll move on to the kind of second section of our piece. And Sam will start off and talk about the role of certification, predominantly PEFC and FSC certification in legality, and what it can and what it can't do, what to look out for in use of certification to give any form of assurance on product supply chains. Then we'll be back with Sonia again to look at due diligence reporting, with particular reference to the Timber Trade Federation's responsible purchasing policy, how that operates, and the tools and helpful things that are around for members of the TTF to facilitate their active due diligence. She's got some examples of good and bad practice that we've come across, and we'll have a look at a little bit of the templates that they use for reporting. Okay, who we are. So Soil Association are, well, we were a monitoring organisation for the EU timber regulation, but Brexit put paid to that. Being based in the UK, we are no longer able to be a monitoring organisation for the UKTR. We are a monitoring organisation for the UK timber regulation. Monitoring organisation is a recognised status within the regulation itself as a body that can provide an approved due diligence system for companies to use. Kind of off the back of that in a way, but also from a historical perspective, we are responsible purchasing policy auditors for the Timber Trade Federation. The RPP has been around since around 2013, possibly even before that, when the EU timber regulation first came about. And we were one of several auditors for that. And then around 2017, off the top of my head, my poor old memory, we became the sole exclusive auditors for the scheme, and so working closely with the TTF to develop the tools and templates that are used, provide an annual auditing service, gap analysis for members of the TTF that are operators under the legislation, which there's a definition we'll talk about a little later. Providing annual audits for the members who are operators. And we'll talk about how the number of those has changed as a result of Brexit and UKTR later. We're also an FSC and PFC certification body. That's the core of our work. So we operate in 66 countries now the other day. We've got over 4,000 clients. We certify to the FSC PFC standards some 26 billion hectares of forest across the world in all the biogeographical zones. We're the lead forest management certification body in the UK, certifying over 90% of the certified forests within UK production, and provide chain of custody certification to a whole host of companies, from little tiny one-off builders merchants to huge corporations. And the forestry department itself is actually part of the Soil Association's wholly owned trading subsidiary, Soil Association Certification Limited. The Soil Association itself being an environmental NGO, a not-for-profit charity lobbying for the restoration of climate, nature and health. And so with our certification and assurance work, we kind of help contribute towards those strategic aims. Okay, timber legality legislation. I suppose we go right back, we could drift back to the late 1980s and Greenpeace putting enormous inflatable chainsaws in B&Q car parks, and essentially beginning the lobbying and raising awareness of deforestation and illegal logging as an issue. And that's kind of where the public awareness and political awareness of illegal logging came about. And it's a huge issue. And I mean, if we go back to that time, there's no legislation to control it, very little in-country legislation, particularly in supply countries, and particularly those in the tropics with regulation. As you see here, the World Bank estimates we've got multi-tens of billions value of illegal logging each year, and all of that is taking money from the tax coffers of the source countries, and all of it is contributing to environmental damage, climate change, causal factors, and biodiversity loss. Illegal logging is one of the big drivers of deforestation, but it's alongside others, conversion for agriculture, and often they're associated with each other. So what illegal logging is when timber is harvested or transported or processed or bought or sold in violation of national or subnational laws. So it can be within the source country, it can be outside of the source country. It's commonly misunderstood to be around simply have they got permission to fell the trees, but it's much more than that, and much broader than that. and we'll look more into the details of what that is. It's any legislation that exists to govern the harvesting, processing, and transport supply chain of that material. So as I mentioned earlier, it's often associated with the conversion of primary forests to agricultural use. So the way the chain often works is cherry picking, selective logging will occur. The high value trees will be picked out from within a forest. You haven't got it deforested at that point, but that kind of opens the doors. It leaves you with a degraded forest, which is more likely to gain consent from national legislators for conversion to agricultural production. Quite often illegal fires are set. Fires you see, we hear about in the fire seasons in Amazonia and in Indonesia are often part of this process. After the selective logging, fires will be set, which degrade the site even further and make it riper for conversion to agriculture. And that land grabbing is often associated with political corruption, illegality, at national, regional, and local levels. And the main driving agents of that agriculturally are oil palm, particularly in Southeast Asia, but also now in West Africa. Beef production, primarily in South America. Soy, again, primarily in South America. Cocoa, West Africa and in the main. And quite a bit of illegal mining as well, gold mining, particularly in the Amazon, copper, cobalt, and others in West Africa. So, yes, I want to show you a little video, and my embedded YouTube link didn't work. So now I'm going to endeavour to pick up YouTube. Has YouTube appeared? Not Sonia or Sam nod. Yes, thank you very much. Right, I'm just going to show a little video of some illegal logging. Hope this comes through okay.
Sorry, Andy, there seems to be not any sound. Is that
There's no sound coming through?
No, I can't hear anything.
Okay, if people can hear me.
Yes.
Okay, luckily there are subtitles. I've just been notified that you can't hear it, but you can read the words. So it's not bad. So here you've got cross-border illegality, selective logging of national parks, corruption often associated with the military, managing the borders. Okay, so now then, let me get back to get my screen back. I need to get my okay. The next video started playing. Bear with. I'm a technological dinosaur. We'll be back soon. How do I get you guys back on the screen?
Andy, we can see your screen now.
You can see my screen.
Yes, it is.
And
now it is your web browser.
here we go. Okay, can you now see a list of national and international legislation? Great. You know the window for showing Here we go. Right, I'm back. I'm back in the room. Apologies, everybody. That was pretty good. That was pretty slick for me, to be fair. So, I mean, what we saw there was a report by an environmental investigative NGO. The evidence they collect isn't necessarily clearly auditable from our perspective as auditors, but what it does is it provides evidence of some risk. And we'll talk a little later about how that is a key element of timber legality legislation and recognition of risks in supply chains being a really important component part of what the responsibilities of people buying timber internationally. So the different national and international legislations that have come about over the last 10 years as a result of the pressure from groups like the Environmental Investigation Agency are the European Timber Regulation, the UKTR, which came about in 2013, similar time, slightly earlier, 2011, I believe, top of my head. The US Lacey Act came into existence. Slightly different emphasis on that, but still a prohibition of illegality in timber supplies. The US Lacey Act has seen the biggest prosecutions in terms of the size of fines for illegality of timber import. Gibson Guitars and lumber liquidators both have multi-million-pound fines for importing illegal timber into the US. Australia also has its Illegal Logging Prohibition Act. Japan has a Clean Wood Act, which is still currently voluntary, although they keep talking about making it compulsory. And if anyone has any up-to-date news on that, let us know. South Korea, quite recently, 2.5 years ago, I'm not sure my measurement of time has been skewed a little by the pandemic. South Korea introduced the Act on Sustainable Use of Timbers, and the TTF have worked in partnership with Forest Trends and have had fact-finding groups from both Japan and South Korea to the UK to discuss with us and the TTF their responsible purchasing policy and how that works, how to work with companies to try and improve their due diligence processes. And now we have the UK Timber Regulation, essentially a direct copy of the European Timber Regulation, but with further implications, which Deanne will be talking about later. How am I doing on time? Okay, I'm not far off. So the EU Timber Regulation, which I'll talk about as the origins of the UK Timber Regulation, is part of the EU's Forest Law Enforcement Governance and Trade Action Plan, which was launched in 2003. And it both looks to reach out to supplier countries and help support them in developing and strengthening legislation and its enforcement, as well as trying to create a barrier to illegal timber by putting requirements for timber importers in market countries. So I think it came into force in 2013. It prohibits operators in the EU from placing illegally harvested products on the market, and legal timber is defined as that produced in compliance with the laws of the country where it's harvested. The regulation applies to timber and a wide range of products, including pulp and paper, but there are some omissions from it: charcoal, chairs, and printed paper being most notable. The regulation allows for monitoring organisations, which I've mentioned earlier as we've held this role, and also defines that each country must have a competent authority, i.e. a responsible enforcement agency in country to investigate compliance amongst those companies covered by the regulation. In the UK, it's Deanne's Office for Product Safety and Standards. In other countries, it's often linked to Departments of Agriculture or police or import customs authorities. It varies country by country. The scope I mentioned slightly earlier. So there are some exceptions, as I mentioned, charcoal, seeds, printed material. There's a scope review underway, but changes have been made. So the FLEGT outreach part, the bit that goes out to the source countries and seeks to kind of strengthen their legislation around it, is setting up voluntary partnership agreements with countries. There's a significant number of those, but once a voluntary partnership agreement has been worked through and a framework set up, then a country can become FLEGT licensed. The only country that's reached this so far is Indonesia. But there are a number of others on the road to it. There are 6 that have signed VPA and 9 more in negotiation. So a quick little list of these VPA partner countries. We've got a number in West Africa and a number in Southeast Asia, but limited to Guyana and Honduras in Latin America. It's a very slow and complex process. Took Indonesia over a decade to kind of get there. It's a complex multi-stakeholder process to try and build in kind of civil society monitoring to give real eyes on the ground to where illegal logging might be occurring, because it's often very remote areas in countries with relatively poor enforcement of local laws and poorly resourced enforcement agencies. So yeah, as you can see, generally focused upon the tropical regions, but the legislation applies worldwide, and as we'll find out later, there's timber coming from temperate sources as well that have high risks. Soil Association has been involved in the VPA processes. We've conducted independent forest monitoring as part of the process in Guyana, where we've historically had quite a lot of work with local organisations certifying the only forest for quite a long time in Guyana to FSC standards, and we continue to be involved in processes. So the UTR itself, the obligation of operators is the placing on the market of illegally harvested timber or timber products, and that operators shall exercise due diligence in placing those products on the market. And to that end, they have a framework of procedures and measures, which is their due diligence system, and it's set out in Article 6 of the regulation. Due diligence exists in 3 steps. Step 1 is to collect information. Step 2 is risk assessment. And step 3 is risk mitigation. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Sonia, who's going to talk through the details of these 3 steps. So, Sonia, shall I stop sharing? And are you going to start sharing yours?
Hi, so I will now attempt to share a PowerPoint. Can you see it? It should start off from the same screen as that Andy finished on. Is that all there?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Good.
cool. Good. Okay, so now. Can I change? Yes, cool, good. So as Andy said, due diligence system is conducted in 3 basic steps. If you have a very low risk product, you might only need to do 2 of those steps, but we'll get into that later. You all probably know quite a lot of this already, but just for the benefit of anyone who's new to this or who maybe has only become an operator under the UKTR, we're going to cover all of the basics. So apologies if this is all your bread and butter and you do this every day. But so the first step is gathering information. The primary thing is you really need to map your supply chain. So without knowing all of the companies involved in a product making its way to you, there is no way that you can be sure that you know where the product comes from. If you don't know where the product comes from, then you don't know what the risks are that are associated with the species and the location that the timber was grown in and harvested at. So that's the first step. And obviously there's a massive variability in how complex supply chains are. It can range from a sawmill associated to the concession that it harvests the timber in, exporting straight to the UK. So that's fairly simple and straightforward and very auditable and controllable from a consumer's perspective, you being the consumer, I guess, you being the importer. to a composite product, which might be made of several different species, which originate in various countries. Obviously, the more steps in the supply chain, the more risks there are of the information that makes its way to you being incomplete or incorrect. The more steps there are, the more risks there are of products perhaps being of information being lost along the way, especially if the product goes through countries which don't have similar requirements for due diligence or access to information on legality. So this will look very different for each of the products that you're looking at. The EUTR outlines very specific risks that you need to assess for each of the components in your product. So the risks are whether there are any risks that the product doesn't comply with applicable legislation. We'll talk about the role of certification a little bit later on, but this can you can use certification in some specific ways to check whether legislation has been complied with or not. The next risk is what is the prevalence of illegal harvesting of the species? So there are several resources available, publicly available, to check whether a species is threatened or vulnerable, or whether it is at a high risk in the area of being illegally harvested. You also need to investigate prevalence of illegal harvesting in the region or in the country. Sanctions imposed by the UN or the EU, and how complex your supply chain is. So we've touched on that a little bit earlier on. I'm now just going to go through some resources and some publicly available resources that you can use to research all of this. So a very popular and comprehensive resource is NEPCON's, now Preferred by Nature's, sourcing hub. So they have created a suite of risk assessments for all timber risk, forest risk commodities, so timber, beef, soy, and palm oil. At the moment, only timber is covered by legislation, but there are developments underway to make the other forest risk commodities have sort of similar legislation in place and similar responsibilities for operators. So these risk assessments are very comprehensive and cover these 5 broad categories of risk. So if you're new to sourcing from a specific country, it's a very good place to get a general overview and a feel for what the situation is. They are quite dense. You wouldn't be expected to become a complete expert in all of this, but if it's a really good starting point. So in terms of other sources of information, the UN and EU sanctions requirement only applies to timber export and import. So there may be some sanctions issued to a country or to specific individuals for things that don't relate to timber. So you only need to worry about specific timber things. You should also be aware of any logging or import or export bans within the country of origin. That's also very important. Sorry, just going to have a sip of my tea. Another important and widely used metric is the CPI, so Corruption Perceptions Index, that Transparency International compiles each year. So it's important to type in Transparency International or Corruption Perceptions Index, or you'll get lots of inflation information, which you're not interested in. Broadly speaking, anything that has a score below 50 would be considered high risk, and anything above 50, low-ish risk. It's obviously a line in the sand, and the situation changes from year to year. So anything that's in the middle, you should still investigate, really, because, yeah. And this can, there's also variability in which sectors are affected by this. So just because something has a low CPI score, you might still be able to investigate and find out that which sectors this applies to most, or so yeah, it's a tool that is useful, but it's not the be all and end all, if that makes sense. So the IUCN is a good resource to check your species, check whether it's vulnerable. It will usually have detailed information on what makes it vulnerable. So definitely look it up. Andy touched on the VPA processes that various countries are engaged in. It's important to note that just because a country is engaged in a VPA process doesn't mean that it's low risk. It means that it's in the process of trying to improve its infrastructure and governance. But so, for example, finding out that a country you're sourcing from is in a VPA process doesn't mean that it's a low risk country. It just means that it's doing things to address the risks that are there. It actually means that it's probably a high risk country, but it's a useful resource to look at. Chatham House has an illegal logging portal, which has lots of useful information. You can search by country or by species. They also host an annual illegal logging kind of workshop that is very useful to attend if you're involved in carrying out due diligence for your company. These are some environmental NGOs which carry out investigative work on environmental issues, and they're very useful to keep an eye out on what they report, because they often have ears closer to the ground than any of the bigger organizations, and it can be hard to have definitive proof of illegality, but any kind of rumors or risks or any reports like this are should definitely be considered as indicators of risk. A lot of them will have newsletters that you can sign up to as well. So yeah, another really useful thing to keep an eye out on. And then various other organizations have developed different tools and resources for conducting due diligence. So also worth keeping an eye out on or taking a look at these. We'll be hearing from the Open Timber Portal folks tomorrow in more detail. It's a very useful resource when you're sourcing from countries in West Africa. So yeah, sorry, that was a whirlwind tour of some resources that can be useful. We'll share the slides with you later on. I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with them already, but anyway, the main point is that you should be able to conduct some basic risk assessment using very publicly available information. Often just a quick Google search will bring stuff up if there is stuff to be put up. So one of the things that you also need to consider in terms of the prevalence of illegal harvesting in the country of origin is whether there's any armed conflict in the area, which might be which the timber sales might be used to fuel, or which might be impacting on the governance within a country. And there are also resources that you can use for that. There often might be some regional variation within that. So there might be some issues in some parts of the country, but not in others. So you need to be able to demonstrate that what you're sourcing carries no risk of being involved in that. So the Heidelberg Institute has a conflict barometer, which is very useful. And the World Bank also has a conflict and like fragility index for the countries that you may be looking at sourcing from. So what's important is once you've carried out your risk assessment, looking at the categories that we've looked at the start of my talking to you today, is any risk that you identify means that the product carries non-negligible risk of being of having of it means that there are risks basically in the supply chain and in the product that you're looking to source. So that if there are risks that you identify, that takes us to the third step of your due diligence system, which is risk mitigation. And any risk mitigation that you undertake needs to be clearly linked to the risk that you identify. So it's really important that every risk that you've identified has a clear corresponding risk mitigation, and that is clear in what way it addresses that risk that you've identified. So it's always useful to use a supply chain map. A lot of the timber traders of the world are now used to all of the legality requirements, which are increasingly applied in the world. So they'll often be well versed in what sorts of documents you may want to look at. It's really important that you verify these documents and check that they actually correspond to the supply chain that you can actually map your supply chain based on those, that those documents make sense in terms of volumes and dates and things like that. The supply chain needs to go back to the source. If it's a low risk country, you don't need to necessarily go back to the forest of origin as long as you can have evidence, as long as you can be confident that the timber is definitely from that low risk origin. If it's from a high risk country, then you need to map it back to the source, because then you need to show in what way that forest or the timber that's extracted from it is legally harvested. So hopefully that makes sense. If there's low risk of illegal logging in a country, you don't need to go back to the forest of origin because you don't need to demonstrate that. So in terms of using the sources of information, things obviously change quite quickly in the world. So you need to make sure that your sources of information are up to date. You also shouldn't assume that just because there are no recent negative reports that there is no risk. So the NEPCON source, the preferred by nature sourcing hub, is a really good thing to look at. And also FSC's controlled wood risk assessments are another really useful tool to look at, because they'll give you a really good outline of the current state of governance in the country that you're looking at. Also, don't forget to do some research on individuals, so company directors, or if you're looking at validating the documents that you've received. It's also a good idea to, sorry, hydration mini break. To just check whether there have been any recent scandals involving any government officials or anyone like that who might have been involved in issuing the documentation that you depend on for verifying that what you're buying is safe to buy in terms of complying with the UKTR. So yes, it is very difficult to have definitive proof of illegality. So any accusations or any hits that you get from your searches should represent a risk. When looking at the documents that you receive from your suppliers, just make sure to go over them with a not an overly critical eye, but definitely look out for anything, especially when it comes from a high risk area. We wouldn't expect you to become experts in detecting forged documents, but anything that's clearly questionable, we would hope that you would look at and identify and maybe question. So as I mentioned earlier, each risk that you identify has to be mitigated. there are various forms of risk mitigation. So for example, if the country that you're sourcing from has a low CPI score and you've identified that there's a risk of corruption, you may want to validate the documents that you receive. So the OPT portal is a good source if you're looking at specific countries, or if you have several suppliers from one country, you may want to kind of compare the documents that you receive from different suppliers to check for consistency. Definitely check things like dates and volumes and species information on anything that you receive. You don't need to necessarily employ an in-house translator. Google Translate is an amazing app. I use it all the time, but it's probably a good idea the first time that you look at a type of document to get key parts of it translated. So my colleague Sam will touch on certification in more detail in a moment. So you've probably heard the phrase that certification is not a green lane. Just because a product is certified, you can't automatically assume that it's low risk. Certification doesn't replace governance in a country. It's very context dependent. How good a risk mitigation it is depends on where you're looking at in the world. There are other legality schemes as well. So you need to make sure that whatever scheme your supplier uses actually meets the requirements of the EUTR. So you need to check that the audits actually look at the categories that your product needs to comply with to be imported safely into the UK. Sometimes the only thing you can possibly do to mitigate a risk is to carry out a supplier visit. So this needs to be an audit and it needs to be documented, and you need to be able to show how your visit actually addresses the risks that you identified in your risk assessment. So TTF has a supplier visit, supplier audit example checklist, both for a factory and a forest. I'll show you that later on today. So yeah, this needs to be a proper objective audit, and you need to show how what you've seen mitigates the risks that you've identified. It's not enough to just, visit your supplier, have a look at the factory, think it looks all right, have a good relationship with your supplier. Yeah, that sort of thing. So and stakeholder consultation is also a good tool to use. So especially where a country is engaged in a VPA process, there will be a lot of civil society engagement and NGOs which look at various types of things, so either social issues or environmental issues. So those are generally quite good first points of contact if you want to do some further research into, you might end up concluding that you can't mitigate risks in a country, but then you could maybe verify with some stakeholders if there's any information you can obtain to and if this all sounds like a lot, that's because if it wasn't a lot and if everything could just keep going on as it was, then the purpose of the EUTR wouldn't be fulfilled. So you should go into it expecting to have to change something, perhaps if you're dealing in anything that's potentially high risk. The point of this all is to make there be less of a market for illegal timber. So if you find that you can't keep purchasing from a specific supplier, you're doing it right. And the final risk mitigation that I've got an example of here is species testing or product testing or isotope testing. You'll find out more about this tomorrow. I think AgroIsoLab are going to be speaking to us about stable isotope testing. Yeah, cool. So that's the type of testing that you pick needs to correspond to what risk you've identified. So if the risk is substitution of species with another one, you need to select the test that will tell you that you're buying the species that you're told. If it's about the location of the species, then stable isotope tests are the only way to go, depending on where it's from and whether there is enough of a sample of data from the look. Anyway, you'll hear more about it in detail tomorrow. It's and then finally, in terms of how you present all of this, it needs to be clearly, basically, as I mentioned before, it needs to be really clear what risk mitigation you've done actually addresses the risk that you've identified. And each of those risks has to be mitigated to low before you can consider the product as non-negligible risk and safe to import. And final thing is you need to do all of this before you buy the product. So you can't buy the product and then kind of scramble around trying to check if it's okay, or, you know, that's a core requirement of the UTR, is that this has to be done beforehand, and you have to reach your decision before you buy the product. So that's it from me, and I'll hand over now to Sam to talk about certification in a bit more detail. Thank you for your ears.
Thank you, Sonia. Sorry, before Sam shares about certification, we have prepared a few questions, polling questions that we share with the audiences. So shall we try 2 questions now to see how everybody thinks, and then to just get your view on the content so far?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Is that okay? Thank you.
Yeah.
And I also saw that Nigel has asked a question in the Q&A chat box. I'm sure Sonia or Sam will be able to help to answer the question later on. And just to anyone else, please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A boxes whenever you do have them. Right, questions. Ready? Let's release the first questions from now. Are you able to see the questions? This is my first time doing this, so. There's a question there.
I can see that.
Perfect. Fantastic, thank you. Thank you. Just a few more seconds. Okay. Right. And we do have a few people wondering whether it might not be needed to do any further work if it is from Canada. Right, great. Thank you, everybody. I think let's end the poll. That is already quite clear. Most majority of people think it is not sufficient. Let's do a little bit more. But we do have people out there who doesn't yet quite clear. It is a good question though. So maybe Sam or Sonia, if they'd like to. Here is the result. Do either of you or Andy want to explain a little bit why?
Coming. Yeah, essentially, knowing that it's a low risk country, obviously, is very helpful. There's negligible risk for the country of origin of your material, but you have to be able to prove that's where it came from. So there's more than knowing Canada is low risk. You need to demonstrate that, transactional documents to prove that, you know, proof that the material has come from that country. So you can do that through documentary evidence relatively clearly, but simply knowing that it's low risk is not enough. Evidence is required. I don't know, Sonia, Sam, anything to add to that?
No, I mean, yeah, there's lots of scenarios where you could, you know, say hypothetically it's a problem. For example, the material may not have originated in Canada, so you'd need, you know, some sort of evidence that it's from Canada to actually correlate it with that low risk designation.
And probably much more commonly, actually, you'll have a composite product. So say you buy a door from Indonesia that might have components from 4 different countries within it. and some of those will be low risk, but you need evidence of quite a long, complex supply chain to show that that is where it came from.
And what sort of evidence Andy and Sam people can use to show that the timber definitely come from
Map the supply chain and evidence each of the stages in those supply chains with transactional documentation that, for the purposes of audit, can have any commercially sensitive financial information or whatever redacted, as long as it's clear in terms of volumes and origins and nationalities, potential shipping documentation, loading information from ports, phytosanitary certificates, etc.
Yeah, thank you. So it is maybe a matter of not about illegality on the timber from Canada, is a way of showing it is definitely from there. And it is, yes, is that right?
Yeah, exactly. It comes back to that core procedure for me of gathering information in the first place and then going through the risk assessment, risk mitigation if you need to, and then a final risk conclusion. But you need to start at the beginning.
Okay, thank you. So that is our question number 1. We have one more, and then Sam, let's start the presentation. Just one more, bear with me, and get the second question out. Is it there? Okay. So this one is about importing from Brazil.
I should say, for anyone who's reading it and they can't read it all, if you hover over the words, the whole text of the second part is readable.
Oh, sorry.
It's all showing all the text.
How about now?
You can do it if you hover your cursor over it.
Okay. Great, fantastic. Okay. Well done. So I think we have majority of answers so far. Let's end the poll now. And then you'd be able to see the result on your screen. Yeah.
Yep.
Fantastic.
That's great. 98% of the right answer. We are preaching to the converted. We are teaching you all to suck eggs. Yeah, very much so. It's not clearly evidenced, much like the previous question. But here you have a country where there are different forest types, and within those forest types, that different risk criteria exist. Plantations in Brazil, in the south of Brazil, tend to be very much low risk. They're not entirely devoid of risk, but much lower, obviously, than the natural forests of the Amazon and associated forests. But still, you need to precisely evidence that supply chain and that's where it came from. Where a country has areas that are high risk and areas that are low risk, going back to that forest of origin is important to demonstrate that. And risk can vary very broadly across the country, as in that example, but it can also be quite granular. You can have literally some regions that have relatively good governance and much lower risk than other regions. And a lot of the risk assessments on the by Nature Sourcing Hub and equally FSC's controlled wood national risk assessments, which is something we haven't raised, but a very similar structure to the by Nature Sourcing Hub risk assessments, was run through a whole list of legality areas under 5 general headings, from forest management through to transport. That they'll detail those, and where the risk is variable across the country, that will be apparent within those risk assessments. So if you are getting from a high risk country and with a variable risk profile in different areas, you're going to have to delve quite deep into it to evidence that. But that is all, ultimately possible with resources that are relatively easy to find in the grand scheme of things. One other thing I was going to mention on that.
Simon asks the
I think we'll leave it.
role of CPI. So what defines a safe country?
Well, I mean, this is it. CPI is a score potentially anywhere between 1 and 100. There's a general understanding that over 50s low risk, under 50s high risk. Obviously, that's extremely kind of arbitrary. And some countries tend to hover around 50, and some years they're below it, and some years they're over it. And it's not like you can trust one year and not the rest. So essentially, you can use it as a barometer of risk. But as long as you're looking at that, you can evidence that you've looked at it and considered it within your risk assessment processes. That's what is expected of you. If you've be an awareness of that, an awareness of where that risk lies, it can vary as well within a country. And the risk corruption perception index and the risk assessments I referred to earlier will focus on the areas where the risk exists and allow you to see that. And if the particular material you're looking for doesn't fit the risk profile for that country or area, then that's a means of mitigation to show that it doesn't apply to the product you're buying, for example.
Great. Thank you, Andy. I saw someone has raised their hand. Shall we take the questions now, or shall we take more?
Can we lead into the Q&A? I'm just aware we're
Yes.
slipping ahead on time, so I think if we don't worry, we'll answer all the questions. But if we bank them up, I'm just aware if you do Q&A as you're going through, time tends to slip away from us. So I think we need to jump on to Sam's, and we'll see how we're doing for time at the end of that. We could possibly fit a short Q&A in at the end of our sessions prior to the end, but there is a scheduled Q&A after the end session, which I'm assuming is on everything. Ciao.
Yes, that's fine. Thank you.
Great. I shall shut up and listen.
Sam, all yours.
Thanks. Morning, folks. I'm going to share my screen. So I'm going to carry on assuming you can all see that, and you can shout if you can't. So thanks all for being here. I'm going to cover certification and how that relates to UKTR and due diligence. A bit like what Sonia said, I'm sure that everything I'm going to cover for most people is your bread and butter and you're well aware, but I will cover the basics and try and pick out the key points as we go through. So I'm going to talk about the main schemes, that's FSC, Forestry Stewardship Council, and PEFC, Programme for the Endorsement of Forest Certification. I'll look at the two main types of certificate in those schemes, the Forest Management FM certificates and Chain of Custody, COC certificates in the supply chain. I'm going to talk about how legality is considered in both of those certification processes and between the two schemes. How the due diligence process is incorporated into those schemes to a greater or lesser extent. The basic mechanics of how to check a product is actually certified that you're receiving from a supplier, and some of the strengths and the weaknesses in those schemes as it relates to UKTR and legality. So the two main schemes, as I said, FSC and PEFC, they are voluntary schemes. So at the most basic level, that means that nobody has to use them. You don't have to be trading certified timber to be able to sell it to somebody. The sort of secondary implication of that is that not everything that a certified company sells, or necessarily anything at all that a certified company sells, is certified. So the way that these schemes are structured, you have the scheme owners define the standards, and those are the standards that the certification body audits to and the certified company complies with. There's also accreditation bodies. These are national or international, which assess the certification body's systems and the way that they go about auditing the certificate holders. And then out of the bottom of that, you obviously get the certified products coming out of the forests and into the supply chain. So it all starts with a certified forest under a forest management certificate. And timber or other non-timber forest products that are harvested from that forest enter the supply chain. So here's an example of a potential supply chain here. You have certified material coming from the forest, going into the paper making supply chain, then being distributed, printed upon and then sold eventually to the consumer. So there's two different approaches between the two main schemes. FSC has its 10 principles and criteria in the document reference given here, which are its worldwide principles for sustainable forest management. And they are then adapted for each national situation into the national standard for that country. Some people refer to this as a top-down approach, so you might hear that. PEFC operates in a slightly different way, where PEFC looks at the national situation where you have regulations, forest management standards, and it assesses them against its own sustainable forest management requirements, so a kind of meta standard, if you like. And if the national scheme meets those standards, then it can be endorsed as part of the PEFC family and begin to supply certified material. So let's have a look at how the legal requirements are incorporated into these two documents from each of the schemes. So for FSC, they have a mechanism called the policy for association. And so any organization, any company or certificate holder that wants to hold a certificate will sign up to and agree to comply with these principles in the policy for association. So within this, you can see illegal logging, trade in illegal wood, violation of human rights, things like destruction of high conservation value forests, and so on. So principle 1 in the FSC principles and criteria is compliance with laws. So that's the two ways that FSC will incorporate that. Here's an example from the UK, Great Britain national standard, I believe. So this is one of the criteria and indicators that we will audit against when we go and do an FM audit. And you can see how this has been, this kind of core principle compliance with law has been adapted down into a national standard and a series of things to verify that. So that's evidence that we can look at audit. In terms of PEFC, so this is from the PEFC meta standard, if you like. We have a clause here, 6.3.1.2, which requires that the organization shall comply effectively with all applicable legislation. It also includes, the rights of stakeholders. And here's an example from two national PEFC national standards or national schemes, however you like to refer to it, where they have that same that same requirement incorporated into those national documents. So for Denmark, for example, you have the forest owner agreeing to comply with the forest management standard, the relevant legislation, and to accept the auditing by a third-party certification body. So here's an example of some of the documents that we might be checking at an FM audit, so a forest management audit. So we would look for legal ownership of the land or the forest, the management plans in compliance with the national standards, harvest concessions, so permission to harvest, felling licenses, etc. Sales documents, proof of payment of tax where required, and also some mechanism for managing complaints and issues raised by stakeholders. So obviously, assuming everybody meets that, you then go ahead and the forest is certified. So at that point, it's publicly onto the relevant database. Both FSC and PEFC have a public database of certificate holders for both FM and COC that enables stakeholders, members of the public, and companies to check the status of any certificate. And for forest management, the FSC audit report is available on the database, and the PEFC audit report is published by the CB. So there is a section on our website where we publish our PEFC FM audit reports. So once you have a certified forest, the material produced from that forest, and I'm going to talk about timber now rather than any non-timber forest products, can come out with a certified claim. So when it's coming out of the forest, that's going to be a full certified claim. In FSC, that's the phrase FSC 100% specifically, and for PEFC, that's the phrase 100% PEFC certified. And I think in a couple of countries, you're allowed a translation of that. There's also on any documents for that timber, being sold into the supply chain, you need that claim. You also need the certificate code, and that enables the purchaser and anybody else for that matter to go and check the status of that certificate on the database. So here's the format of the FSC and PEFC certificate codes. So once you've had material come out of the forest, it's then into the supply chain, and it's under the chain of custody certification world kind of area of authority, if you like. That applies all the way through the supply chain. So it will start with timber coming from a certified forest, going to the primary processors. So that's usually sawmills, pulp mills, that kind of thing. And then once, all the way down through the supply chain as far as the finished product sold to the consumer. So for the chain of custody to be maintained and for that certified status to carry on all the way, each organization that takes legal possession of the timber needs to hold a chain of custody certificate. Note that that says legal possession, not physical possession. There are cases where physical possession does not require a chain of custody certificate. So what that chain of custody certificate does is it verifies that the company can track the inputs and outputs from their system, make the relevant claims, and then pass that claim on to their customers and keep that material certified. One thing that neither the FSC or PEFC system do by their nature is provide direct origin information. As you'll see in a couple of slides, they are based on a mass balance or a volume through the supply chain and through each certificate. So it's not verification of origin all the way back to the forest, but it shows you that there's enough certified material from a particular place entering the supply chain. So at each link in the chain, there's 3 companies or 3 organizations involved. So you have the organization in the middle, which will be the one that we're currently looking at at any point in the supply chain. They will have their suppliers and they will have their customers. So they obviously source from their suppliers. They ask them for certified material, and they will receive that material from their supplier along with documentation showing claims and codes. They then process that material or take legal possession of it, trade it, whatever they do, and then sell it onto their customers, making the same or compatible claims to the next person down the supply chain. So you've got an example here, logs going to pulp and then going into cardboard, becoming packaging and food containers. So at each of these links in the chain, you may have a change in volume, you may have a change in form. So we need to be able to track that through the supply chain, and that's what our audits do every year for these companies. So here's the basic process for an individual company. They identify the products that they need and certified suppliers who can give them those products. They source that material. They keep it separate where necessary from non-certified material, depending on their control system. They keep records of their process, any changes in volume, conversion factors, that kind of thing. And then they sell the relevant certified material to their customers. And there we go. So core to both of the schemes is the need for the chain of custody company to have a quality management system, a QMS. So for most companies, this means a set of documented procedures that describes how they control the material through their system. So between FSC and PEFC, these requirements are a competent management representative, so somebody to run the system, documented procedures, training for all the staff that are involved at any critical control points, record keeping, including those conversion factors that I mentioned. Origin of species is included in both schemes. Commitments to health and safety, so protecting their workforce. A process again for dealing with complaints and for dealing with any instances of non-conforming product, whether that's arriving at them or going from them to their customers. PEFC has a minimum due diligence system, DDS requirement built into the standard. And another unique one for FSC is they have a transaction verification process, which they require companies to cooperate with. And that's when they will choose a particular product or a supply chain, and they will look at all the involved companies and actually do a full, mass balance analysis all the way down through to make sure that there's no fraud or false claims going on. So now we're into things that we're going to be checking at audit. So specifically volume control. So these are the accounting records that companies will keep. They need to keep records of their quantities, invoice references for their material that they're purchasing, so their certified inputs, and the sales that they make, so their certified outputs. They need to keep a record of the material category or the material status, which is often referred to as the claim. So FSC 100, FSC mix 70% for their inputs and outputs, and make sure they are compatible. If they are mixing in controlled wood, then that's another claim to keep track of, and another, another percentage and volume to keep track of. And then they also need to have a way of referencing between documents. So we would expect delivery notes, invoices, those kind of things to be able to reference each other and be, verified and cross-referenced. So we obviously at audit need to see evidence that there's enough certified material purchased to cover the certified material sold. And we consider the conversion factors and any wastage, for want of a better word, that is included in that. And the company is required to describe that methodology for calculating their conversion factors and keep records to demonstrate that that's accurate. I'm just going to very quickly show you a couple of examples of conversion factors and how we would consider these at audit and how you would want to consider them when you're looking at transactional documents in your UKTR due diligence. So if you're receiving documents going from sawmill to secondary processor to, distributor and then to you want to check that the volumes are consistent and realistic. So sawmilling is obviously the process of round logs going into usually various sizes of rectangles. So there's obviously going to be some conversion there. Depending on the sawmill process, depending on the species being sawn and the products coming out the other end, you would look at a yield of somewhere between 40 to 65%. The bigger the log, the better the yield, usually. But like I said, that's going to change with species, process, etc. One thing about sawmills is that there is no waste. Everything that arrives over the weighbridge will be sold, but not all of it's going to be sold as timber. So you have bark, sawdust, chips, etc. going out the door as well. So if you look at a process like joinery, it's obviously very different. You can have holes drilled out of things, you can have cutting, profiling, gluing, you can have completely different form factors coming out of the factory compared to what arrived. So this is where the company is, really needs to keep track of exactly the processes they're doing, and some of them will have computer systems that do that for them, and for some of them it will actually be job specific. And we would look for records of that at audit, and that's something that you should look for in your due diligence. A couple more. Charcoal is sometimes a very challenging one to work out. You take wood and you burn it in a reduced oxygen environment to produce the charcoal. the rule of thumb is 3 to 5 tons of fresh wood will make 1 ton of charcoal, but that's going to change sometimes significantly depending on the moisture content of the wood, the species, the technology being used, you know, the sophistication of the charcoaling process. Charcoal is also a product which is sometimes combined with other additives to make the final product. So you need to look quite carefully at that when that's involved. And then a final example, we have printing, usually onto paper, at least that's what this example is. So depending on the printing process used, whether it's litho or digital, and the design and the form factor, you can have vastly different conversion factors, wastage and testing. Lots of printers will overprint. There will be cutting that's involved afterwards to produce the final product, and finishing processes. And for most printers, certainly in the UK that I've been to, they have a computer system that basically works it all out for them. So it's quite easy for them to show the evidence of that. So one very useful tool for us at Audit is the annual volume summary that certified companies produce. So that shows for their products and their processes what their inputs have been, the inputs that they've used in production and the remaining stock. And then it compares that to their remaining stock of outputs and the outputs that they've sold in a given period. And that's a very quick thing for an auditor to check and to make sure that everything looks realistic and reasonable. So due diligence, as Sonia described, the process of gathering information, risk assessing that information, mitigating any risks that you identify, and then coming to a final risk conclusion. That is built into the PEFC standard. So we can see here, to minimize the risk that the procured material originates in controversial sources. So PEFC has a minimum due diligence requirement on its chain of custody certificate holders. If a chain of custody certificate holder is sourcing only PEFC certified material, then they only have to perform the first step of that due diligence, which is gathering information. But there is that requirement to go further where relevant. Here's a definition of controversial sources, and you can see that the first line is not complying with local, national, or international legislation. So we can see that legality is built into these schemes, but it's not the only thing that they're worried about. And so UKTR and EUTR necessitate other checks, over and above the certified status of the material. And in that process that Sonia described of gathering information, risk assessing, risk mitigation, certification is should be most commonly used as a risk mitigation for any identified risks. So there's that PEFC process. So here's just a brief slide on how certification can relate to UKTR. So as Andy and Sonia said, there's a consistent line that certification cannot be considered a green lane under these legislations. I hope that I've covered various reasons why that is, but here's just one example from Earthsite, which was mentioned in the chat as another useful resource, of illegal material coming out of certified forests in Ukraine. So that's obviously in contravention with local laws, and it would be in contravention with UKTR, but it's also, not acceptable under the certification schemes, but it's still going on. So there's multiple NGO reports criticizing the schemes, highlighting individual problems, and therefore FSC and PEFC on their own are not enough to meet the UKTR and EUTR negligible risk conclusion. You can all read, so I'll let you have a look at these and have a think, but these are maybe something that you can consider in our discussion for later. and we can expand on if we have the time. But I'm conscious I need to get back to Sonia and let her finish off our section of the presentation. Thanks.
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, that was a really good detailed description of what certification actually means in practice. And in terms of the limits of certification, I really wanted to highlight that point about a company being certified not being risk mitigation in itself. Especially chain of custody certification is a product certification, not a company certification. So it's a thing that we see quite a lot, where customers require their suppliers to be certified, but that don't actually bother to source certified product, which makes the whole thing completely pointless. So if you're using certification as risk mitigation, it's really important to actually buy certified product, because that's the only way that it works. I hope that makes sense, but please do ask if it's unclear in any way. So what I'm just going to briefly touch on now is the various tools that TTF has developed to help you make to help you structure your due diligence reporting. So I'm just going to share my screen. What am I sharing? I'll share screen 2. So if you're involved in carrying out due diligence for your company, then you will have definitely come across something that looks very much like this. This is basically the text of the EUTR copied out into a neat table format. So this covers all the information that you need to have access to. There needs to be supporting evidence to that. So what often you won't complete this until after you've bought the product, but if that makes sense. So you do need to do the risk assessment. It's not a linear process, basically. It can be a bit of a circular thing. You might assess the risk, find some risks, mitigate them. In the process of mitigation, you might find some other risks which you then need to mitigate again. And then only once you've done all of that will you have some of this information which is required in the first section of the legislation, which includes things like who you then sold the product onto. So it can be sometimes not entirely intuitive. But the risk assessment part of this covers each of the risks which you need to investigate. If you tick non-negligible risk on any of that, you need to then move on to risk mitigation. Any statement that you make in terms of whether you believe there is a risk or not in your supply chain has to have supporting sources of information. So, for example, if you find out that there is risk of illegal logging in one region but not in another, and you're sourcing from the region in which you say there is low risk, then you need to be able to support that statement with some form of evidence. This is also what the competent authorities would use to check that you're doing your due diligence properly, as it's exactly the text of the legislation copied into bullet points. So this is the main thing that we use at audit. Another thing which is really useful is there's a couple of example supply chain maps depending on the complexity of your supply chain. We always love, as auditors, we always love receiving a nice annotated supply chain map with reference documents, but it's not just for our benefit. Doing that should also help you to make sure that you have a complete picture. So, you know, be the auditor you want to see in the world. No, sorry. Bit of silliness. So this is a tool which is available from the TTF with different examples of ways you could present your supply chain information. TTF have also developed a field-based supplier audit checklist. You're not required to look at this if you identified a specific risk and that is the only thing you want to look at, and you're then able to demonstrate that you've mitigated that risk with your visit, then that's absolutely fine. It's just an example of the types of things you might want to consider and look at in detail when you're visiting your supplier. And then I just wanted to talk in just briefly talk about examples of good and bad due diligence. I'm just going to stop sharing if I can figure out how to do it. Okay, I can't stop that. I can't seem to figure out a way of doing that.
There should
So,
be a stop sharing button somewhere.
oh yeah, here.
Red, yes.
Doe.
Well done.
Okay. Didn't want you to see my hastily scribbled notes. But yeah, basically, when auditing TTF members, what we would consider a good submission is something that has detailed evidence supporting each statement which is made and using sources which are recent. We're looking to see some evidence that the documents which you may have received from your supplier have actually been read and done a basic analysis and just checked for any glaring errors. Companies are so well versed now in what is required in terms of legality that they'll just, they'll often supply kind of packs of information. You do need to still check what you've received. We would look for an initial risk conclusion from your risk assessment before you move on to risk mitigation. That just allows it to be very clear how the risk mitigation addresses the risks. So sometimes just for speed, I guess, and efficiency, people might, you might kind of mix the mitigation and the risk assessment all in together, but then it's not clear how the mitigation actually addresses what risks you've identified, if that makes sense. So yeah, there is evidence, clear evidence of the risk mitigation which was taken. And a very important point is that the due diligence was done before the product was purchased. So yeah, please remember to build that into your systems. Some examples of due diligence which we come across, which is a bit less great, is stating that a product is certified, therefore it's low risk and needs no further risk assessment. We've covered that a little bit already, but that is, yeah, certification is in a green lane, so you still need to check all of the other risk areas. The supply chain may not be fully mapped or may not be fully evidenced, so there may be gaps in the supply chain. If there are any clear inconsistencies in the documentation which is provided, that shows to us that you may not have taken the time to actually look through what you were given by your supplier. Using kind of subjective statements like having a long-term relationship with the supplier or being on really good terms with the supplier or not having had any issues in the past, that's not objective facts which you can use to determine the risk in your supply chain, if that makes sense. So kind of to summarize, what we look for is a clear supply chain map with evidence and substantiated links in that supply chain, assessing each of the risks which are required under the UKTR with sources, risk conclusion before risk mitigation, and then a clear narrative to show how your risk mitigation addresses the risks that you've identified. We also always ask whether you've rejected any supplies in the last 12 months. This may seem to be a strange question, but the basic point is to have a sense check on whether it's working. if that makes sense. The EUTR is a tool for change. So if there is no change, that shows that the tool isn't being used correctly, if that makes sense. Unless you're really lucky and you're buying from all low risk countries and your supply chains are all super short and everything's really under control, you should expect there to be some potential changes along the way. So that's it from me. Do
Thank
we
you.
have more poll questions?
We do have two more poll questions, and I saw Ken has just raised his hand. I'm conscious of time, so and Deanne is here already. So shall we say let's have 5 minutes break for those of you who wanted to go to toilet, have a cup of tea, and then I don't know if Ken is still here. Ken, if you are still here, I'll just going to unmute you, if that is okay. Or I can't find you now. Where's Ken? Here we go. Right, Ken, I just unmuted you. You should be able to speak whenever you are ready. And for the others, please come back at 10 past 12. Sorry, at 5 past 12. 5. Thank you.
In the absence of input from Ken, was it?
Yes, yeah.
But I suggest, Ken, if you have a question, pop it in the chat and we'll bring them all together in the Q&A session after Deanne's presentation.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, hi,
Yes.
Ken.
Hi, Ken.
Sorry. Yeah, we fully understand from day one that certification, whether it be FSC or PEFC, isn't a green light through the EUTR and now the UKTR. The example that you've highlighted over the sanitary login situation in Ukraine, whereby maybe some dubious certification claims were coming out of the Ukraine. Obviously, there's a need for further investigation. But if you've got no real evidence or suggestions of that type of mixing of products, therefore you can have confidence in the certification scheme. It's difficult to start to gather the sort of information that we're being asked to gather because our supply base don't understand the need to supply it to us.
Yeah, I mean that's been an issue with EUTR from the beginning, has been educating suppliers that it's actually a requirement, and now with the UKTR having to convey that to companies within the EU that have never had to supply it before and don't have to supply it when they're trading with each other, is certainly a difficult element of it. Fundamentally, if it's a low risk supply chain, there's no evidence of risk and it's a certified supply chain, it's quite minimal transactional evidence that's required. But equally, I know suppliers don't want to reveal their sources. And even if all the financial information is redacted, so that it's only kind of volume and transactional evidence, then it's still fundamentally, you'll know where they got it from. And so I understand that resistance, but that's the regulation. And I'm sure Deanne will address that in the next presentation. I mean, in terms of Ukraine, it's sanitary logging. It's also high-level political corruption that just is not covered in the scope of a certification audit. It's accusations of concessions being awarded to harvesting companies that involve bribes to politicians that are now currently on the run from Interpol. So it's something that would never get picked up at a certification audit, but fundamentally undermines the legality of potentially huge amounts of material coming out of Ukraine that could be in forests that have been audited and are compliant with the standards at that level. But standards can't develop everything. But there are criticisms of the schemes themselves for not kind of acknowledging those kind of high level corruption issues and making kind of judgments themselves on that, and just sticking within the frameworks of their own procedures, which is kind of the nature of the beast of certification. But I think they could look at themselves. I hope that answered your question. I'm just worried I need to do the one to the loo before that starts. So I'm going to pop my camera off, and anything else comes up, I see someone's around.
Yeah, sure. We'll be ready in a few minutes. Thank you. Right, are we back here to Diane? Hello, Diane, are you here?
Yeah, I'm here, Zhao. Sorry, I'm just trying to, right. I can't see anywhere where I can share my screen.
Oh, it's because I'm sharing. Let me just stop now.
It's all right, I can see it.
Yes.
Let me try and get my presentation ready then.
Yeah.
I've never shared screen on Zoom, so I'm a bit, I don't want to share this. Sorry.
No, that's okay. Yes, something's coming up.
I didn't pick what I wanted to share though. Can you
Now
see
it
my
is.
presentation?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, cool.
Now we can.
Great.
Well done. Great.
Can you see
Okay.
me as well?
Yes, we can see you.
Fortunate.
Oh, good. Oh, good. Right. I hope everybody now come back. So hello again, everybody. We will start session 2 of today. Here we have Deanne from the OPSF, the UK Competent Authority. Deanne will be sharing with us the UKTR enforcement here in the UK and another session on flag T. All the questions, please do continue entering them in the Q&A or the chat box, and then we will hopefully try to pick everything in about half an hour or so. Thank you very much, and over to you, Deanne.
Thank you, Zhao. Hi. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Deanne Hughes. I work for the Office of Product Safety and Standards, and I'm responsible for enforcing the EU timber regulations. Hopefully, I do know most of you. So I'll start my presentation. It's nice to be doing something resembling real work after all the lockdown. So I'm going to have a look at a couple of, just going to go through who we are, how we enforce the regulations, the changes that came into force on the 1st of January, monitoring organisations, and then I'm going to have a look at, I think, what has been one of the biggest issues since the 1st of January, which is verification of FLEG licences. So those of you that don't know us, we are the Office of Product Safety and Standards. We are part of BEIS, the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, but we enforce the regulation on behalf of DEFRA. We are committed to working collaboratively with our partners, including the businesses that we regulate, and we also feed back into DEFRA to try to influence policy and regulation. And as you can see, being part of DEFRA, being part of BEIS and enforcing a regulation on behalf of DEFRA we do have to balance effective enforcement and encouraging growth in this sector. The approach we take to enforcement is in line with the regulator's code. So we engage with those we regulate. I think when we're investigating a business, we have a lot of communication with them. We base our activity on risk, and we will talk about that later. We share information. We have a LinkedIn page, and anyone is free to ask us a specific query about a problem. We offer clear guidance, and that's posted on our website, and we are transparent. So all enforcement sanctions that we issue are on our website. And by taking this approach to enforcement, we think we create a level playing field through which businesses can compete effectively. We take a risk-based approach to projects, and we carry out intelligence-led investigations. So our risk is based on the country of origin, a processing country, a product, or a species. I think an example of this would be the project that we're currently carrying out, which is looking at fuel wood. And we're looking at fuel wood for several different reasons. One, it's the largest in-scope product imported into the UK by volume. Obviously, there is a company called Drax that probably heavily influences that. Also, there are recent issues identified with corruption in Ukraine, which I think was being referred to earlier. And in Ukraine, there is a log export ban, and it is believed that businesses are circumventing the log export ban by coding logs as fuel wood. So that's why we're looking at that. And then we do intelligence-led investigations. So supply chain mapping. If I come across a business in China that is supplying products into the UK, and I have concerns about that business, I can identify all UK importers buying from that business. We'll also investigate substantiated concerns made by NGOs or other businesses. So please feel free to raise any concerns you have about your competitors with me. And we revisit non-compliant businesses. So, for example, when we did the fuel wood project, the first thing we looked at are any businesses that have previously been non-compliant operating in this area. This is just a little run through of where we are. The regulation came into force in 2013, and we took very much an awareness raising approach, understanding the sectors, understanding what due diligence looked like. You're not the only people that have to learn what due diligence should look like. We have to as well. Then from 2015, we started to carry out risk-based projects and focused on areas of high risk, and started to up the sanctions that were issued. In 2017, we then began to make it a policy to revisit non-compliant operators, and that has certainly seen an improvement in levels of compliance, but also our first prosecution and fines issued. And then since 2019, we've been preparing for the UK to leave the EU. We wrote guidance on UKTR, which is published on our website, and we delivered, I think in the end, about 15 workshops through different trade associations, but also certification services such as FSC. So basically, if anyone wanted us to talk about leaving the EU, we were available to do it. So the EU timber regulations and the UK timber regulations are very, very similar. What differs is who carries out due diligence. So the purpose of both regulations is to prevent illegally harvested timber being placed on the market. The scope of what's in scope of the regulation is the same. The competent authority issues penalties, with the exception of prosecutions, which obviously a court does that. And both regulations distinguish between operators and traders. The EU regulation sets out the due diligence requirements for operators. And an operator is any natural person or legal person that places timber on a market. And a trader is anyone that is then, in the course of commercial activity, buys or sells that product on that internal market. So the obligations for operators and traders under the EU. For operators, it's to exercise due diligence when placing a product on the EU market and to maintain and regularly evaluate that due diligence system. And then the obligations for traders are to identify who they bought the product from and, where applicable, who they sold it to within the EU market. So since we've left the EU, what's changed is the market that you're placing the product on. So you were an operator under the EU market, under the EU regulations, when you placed a product on the EU market for the first time. So you either imported it into the EU for the first time, or you cut the tree down for the first time. Now you are an operator when you first place the product on the UK market. So when it's first imported into the UK, or when the tree is cut down in the UK, because it also applies to domestically harvested timber. And that's what changed. What's changed is the market that you're operating in. So you now have to do due diligence on products bought from the EU, whereas you didn't before. You would have been a trader. I think this slide probably just reiterates that what's changed is you are now operating in the UK market, not the EU market. So there are also changes then. If you are exporting to the EU, the people you're selling to will be required to carry out due diligence as well under EUTR. So you may be required to provide them with different or more documentation than you would have previously. So monitoring organisations existed in under EUTR and UKTR. They maintain and regularly evaluate a due diligence system, and they grant you as operators the right to use that system. And if you do not use that system appropriately, they are obliged to tell the competent authority. And the competent authority audits them every 2 years. What has changed is that you can now only use monitoring organisations under UKTR that are registered within the UK. Not the EU. Some monitoring organisations have a presence in both the EU and the UK, and they are recognised separately by the EU Commission and DEFRA. So, FLEGT. The UK has a voluntary partnership agreement, a VPA, with Indonesia. And that means that timber in scope of the VPA that's imported from Indonesia to the UK must be accompanied by a FLEG licence that should be verified by OPSS. If it has a verified FLEG licence, then it's not required to have due diligence carried out at UKTR and is assumed to be timber that was legally harvested. A FLEG licence is only valid to the country of origin. You cannot move products with a FLEG licence using the FLEG licence as a customs document from one market to another, i.e. Indonesia to the EU and the UK, or Indonesia to the UK and then the EU, because once the FLEG licence has been used to clear customs once, it's no longer valid. You must then carry out either EUTR or UKTR, depending on where your journey is going. So I've tried to make a slide that hopefully makes it easy for you to look at your FLEG licenses. So as I said, the UK can only verify licenses issued under the UK Indonesian VPA, and it will state that it's a UK FLEG license in this top left-hand box. I'm hoping you can see my cursor that I'm using, my little arrow. A UK FLEG license will have GB at the end of its license number in box 3, so it'll have a long license number and then GB. It can only be used to clear customs in the country of destination identified in box 2. All licenses have an expiry date, and this has been an issue recently because I think there's some container or shipping issues in the Middle East. We cannot verify a license that has expired, and the length of time a license is valid for is written into the regulation. So That's a legal requirement. We cannot verify a license issued under the EU Indonesian VPA. So a FLEG license issued to where Belgium is the country of origin, we cannot verify that license. We do not have access on the Indonesian IT system to look at that license, and Belgium can't verify our licenses either, and that hasn't changed. We could never verify licenses to a different country destination, but what has changed is that you would have only been a trader. Once a license has been used to clear customs in the country of origin, it cannot be used again. So if your product comes into Belgium, you clear customs in Belgium, and then you want to transfer it to the UK, you then have to carry out due diligence under UKTR. And what you need to be very careful you don't do is identify your product as a flagged product, because it's no longer a flagged product. So I think it's box 44. There's a code that you will put on your single administration document which says this is a flagged product. You must not identify your product as a flagged product, because they will want a flag license, and the flag license you have is no longer valid as a customs clearance document. Any questions? I will stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Deanne. We do have a few questions in the chat box and the Q&A, but before we go to the questions, we try the poll questions as well. We have a few questions on flag T issues. So let me release the questions now. Bear with me a second. Right, we have 3 questions here. Please do let us know your answer. Thank you. Let's give it 1 minute or so. Can anyone see the questions on your screen? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. So the flag T may not apply to everyone here, but for those of you who do import from Indonesia, do let us know what you think. Just a few more seconds. Everyone submitted yet? Can't. Okay, right, let's stop in 3, 2, 1. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Let's end the poll, and then you should be able to see the result now. Right, first. Fantastic. No, we do.
Fine name, great.
Fantastic. Okay. So the second one, so a few people have said they have been encountering issues due to using breakbolt and transit via Europe. And a few, oh my gosh, 6 people have said, 3 people said not always able for them to find the exact country of destination in Europe when applying for the flag T license. So maybe those of you who picked that answer, if you could type in your precise issues later or in the chat box individually to us or to Deanne, that would be very useful. Thank you. Deanne, would you like to elaborate anything further on flag T, particularly with the recent issues due to using break bulk and
yeah, I mean, so obviously I'm probably not as familiar with the shipping issues as you guys are, but it seems that there's 2 issues. One, businesses aren't realizing that their flag license needs to be for final destination GB if you're going to clear it in GB, or that if you reroute on the way and you were going to GB and then you end up in Belgium, your flag license cannot be verified. So you can't just change your route at the last minute between the UK and GB, and you must make sure that the country of destination on the flag license is the same place that the product is going to clear customs. And if you're not going to clear customs in Belgium, you're just going to transition through to the UK, then you still need a UK flag license. Those appear to be the issues that businesses are contacting us most about.
Right. So if any one of you have also encountered similar issues, maybe you'd like to enter your more details here or tell us later. Thank you very much, everybody.
Could I just ask a question of Deanne? Is that just a, I mean, so yeah, I mean, I really feel for companies who are suffering from transit issues where material that they thought was going to land in the UK ends up landing somewhere else because of the international transport issues that are happening at the moment. But just wanted to confirm in my mind that if material, flag T material goes into Europe and is then potentially processed traded out of Europe to the UK, that the UKTR applies fully, whether the flag license can form any part of risk mitigation or whether kind of full supply chain mapping and other risk mitigation methods are required in total, or whether the flag license itself can actually form part of that mitigation.
So yes, you do have to carry out full due diligence. But yes, your flag license, it can form part of that due diligence. So for example, do you have documents proving legality of harvest in the EU? Well, yes, you've got a flag license. What is difficult is that I cannot confirm if that flag license has been verified. So you need to provide that evidence. So in the UK, we send an email to the importer confirming that the license has been verified. And so you would want the equivalent of that. There is a lot of information on your flag license that will form part of your due diligence, but you have to risk. So if your product comes from Indonesia to Italy and then to the UK, you're going to have to do full due diligence on that from Italy onwards. Your risk mitigation for the first part of the journey might be there are NGO reports about illegal logging in Indonesia, but Indonesia has a VPA with the UK. This product entered the EU on a flag license. So you certainly use your flag license as part of your due diligence.
So the flag license that's to Italy and signed off by the EU,
yeah,
with evidence that that was signed off and verified. So therefore the flag license with its external verification from the intermediary country can then provide part of that offence from us.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you, Deanne. Another question. So I'm going to just go through the questions in the chat box and the Q&A. So let me just clear this. Let's start with this one on flag T from Philippa. So please clarify what is happening with flag T in regards to the health check and with the UK.
So I don't understand what's happening.
Yes, I'm not sure. Philippa, would you like to elaborate a little bit more on what do you mean by health check? And the second part of Philippa's question, will the UK government keep the flag T licensing system if the UK, if the EU abandons it? I don't know if that is something, Deanne, that you could.
So as far as I'm aware, the UK government has no plans to withdraw from the VPA with Indonesia, irrelevant of what the EU do.
Yeah.
But I didn't understand the first part of the question.
So Philippa, please do clarify. And in the meantime, let's go to Stuart. Has asked a question. So we have bought in flag T material in the past under our BM Trada forest product scheme. Can we still sell the material under this CFC scheme when our supplier supplies a flag T license? Do you mean by CFC scheme? again, that is something, not
It's
something
a TRADA's own chain of custody scheme, similar to FSC and PFC chain of custody scheme. It's a simple transactional verification, material accounting, kind of in-house unaccredited scheme that they run.
It's up to them what they sell under their screen. I'm not sure I can comment on that. Yeah.
Off the top of my head, I would think that the nuts and bolts of the COC scheme will capture some of the information that will be useful for you to evidence due diligence of the steps in the supply chain. But the certificate on its own won't be enough. You would need the certificate with the transactional pieces that sit behind your compliance to get that certificate. If that makes sense.
Yes.
Is that...
Yes.
watching Dan's level of concern.
I'm not sure you. So nothing's changed. It's just that you can still sell flagged. I mean, I don't know why you'd need chain of custody certification with a flagged licensed product. The flagged license says it's legally harvested.
The brought in flag, yeah. I mean, I suppose I'm not sure, Stuart. My assumption had been that it was flagged material that had gone into an intermediary country and then come out, like the situation I was talking about, where that chain of custody might be handy for evidencing the bit from the intermediary country into the UK, because it might have transactional documents behind it.
So I would say that then the flag license has much less value. So if the product goes from Indonesia into China, China's not going to verify that license. But what you won't have a flag license. What you'll have is a V legal license. So you'll use that to evidence legality of harvest as an example, but you will need to do a lot more than if that flagged product went into a flagged country like the EU. I hope that answered the question.
Thank you, Dan. Right, just one more on flag T before we move on to other UKTR related questions. So this one is from Peter. Do you need a license, a flag T license per shipment, or can it cover multiple shipments?
Off the top of my head, I'm not certain, but I believe it's one shipment. But if you email me, I'll find out for you. I'm pretty certain it's one shipment though.
On top of my head, I think it covers multiple containers.
Okay, but one shipment.
But I think we need to check that.
Okay.
Great. So no other questions on flag T that I can see here. Let's move on to UKTR questions. So we got one interesting one here. We import timber solely from suppliers located within the EU, and as such, they are subject to EUTR regulations themselves. Those suppliers are unable to supply us with full supply chain information, as they are often not the first importers into the EU. Each product is only made up of one species, so not a very complicated chain. We are provided with the country of harvest, and we make the necessary checks on this country. But can we use the knowledge that they have undertaken EUTR due diligence themselves as part of our risk mitigation?
The short answer to that is no. It's not a question you can just answer a yes or no to. It depends what that country of origin is. It depends, EUTR is enforced at different levels in different member states. I think we all know that. I come across businesses in the UK that, although have been subject to EUTR, have never heard of it. So I think you have an obligation under UKTR to do full due diligence. They may pass you information that you can use, but just saying I don't need to do a risk assessment because this business is subject to EUTR isn't valid. The businesses in Russia are subject to Russian timber regulations, but you wouldn't use that as a mitigating regulation, mitigating action, would you? It very much depends on the supply chain, the species, the complexity, all those factors.
It sounds like to me if they're buying from a trader, defined as trader within the EU, who therefore are just getting species and origin information from the operator who's brought it into the EU, and therefore they don't have that operator's due diligence information, that what you need to get is the operator who brought it into the EU's due diligence information, which can then inform your due diligence. And you can kind of double check their evidence, and it'll give you the pointers as to where it really did come from. But you need to penetrate that far up the supply chain to at least define through transaction documents your country of origin. And if that's low risk, that's as far as you need to go. If it's a high risk country, on you go, you need to go further. That
Sounds about right.
Sounds about right.
Thank you, Deanne. Thank you, Andy. Next one is from Friendly. Which documents are required for timber harvested in low-risk countries within EU? Is a statement by the supplier stating country of harvest and tree species enough? Traders from EU are often reluctant to provide any additional information. This is a very typical and common question.
No, the regulation clearly requires you, even from low-risk countries, to provide documents proving legality of harvest. A statement from your supplier is worthless. I don't know if your supplier is telling the truth or not, and nor do you. You still need to prove documents proving legality of harvest. You may not, what you won't need to do is go down to concession level. So your risk assessment and risk mitigation should be a lot simpler, and how far down the supply chain, but you do still need to provide documents proving legality of harvest.
Thank you. So hopefully that answered Francie's question, and let's try some more polling questions. We've prepared a few more that are also relevant here. If I launch the questions now, so there are 2 questions on your screen. Please do let us know your answer to those 2 questions. Thank you. Is it working? Currently, not anyone has submitted any answers, so I don't know what is happening.
The questions are getting more thought-provoking, so I think it took a little more
now it works.
time for the responses to start coming through. Got the order right.
Well done. Let's just give it a few more seconds. Okay. Let's stop in 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Let's end the poll here and then share the result. Great. For the first one, on the use of FIC when importing timber from Ukraine. So most of the people here said, no, FIC alone is not sufficient for Ukraine. And for the second question on Myanmar, most of people have said, no, you can't import anything from Myanmar, even via EU, because this will be a violation. I think still 10 people also said none of above. This is subject to case-by-case review. So Deanne or Andy, would you like to maybe just go through each of those 2 questions? Because I think that there might be some misunderstandings here among our audiences.
I'll happily address Ukraine because we've already just discussed it. Blinded by the sun, even through a curtain. So we've already discussed the issue with Ukraine, that certification is used for mitigation in lots of circumstances, but where evidence suggests that it isn't sufficient to mitigate the risk, which is the case in Ukraine on a number of different issues, that a lot more is needed. I might let Diane go first on the Myanmar teak one, politically.
Yeah, so anybody that was importing teak from Myanmar via the EU prior to the 1st of January this year was taking advantage of a loophole that existed. So the situation now, since then, obviously the UK government has sanctioned Myanmar, and the situation has got worse because there's also been a coup. If you bought teak from Myanmar into the UK now, you would need to prove that that product was already on the EU market, and you would also you would still need to do due diligence. And I would then look at it in a case-by-case review. It's not a question I can answer generally.
Right. So does that mean it is not a total ban on teak from Myanmar?
There's never been a ban on teak. There's never been a ban on teak. You can import teak from Myanmar if you can carry out due diligence that is compliant with the obligations outlined in the regulation. What has happened is that no EU member state has ever seen a compliant due diligence system on teak from Myanmar.
Okay.
There isn't a ban on teak from Myanmar. I have no authority to ban teak from Myanmar. I can't do that. What I can tell you is that you can import it, but I have never seen a compliant due diligence system carried out on teak from Myanmar. So, which is why this is an impossible question to answer, really, especially for me. And that includes the period of time that we went through, whereby lots of certification services and businesses were able to attempt to do due diligence and give it to all the member states to review together prior to making the import. Even those ones were not compliant. It's in UKTR requires you to identify the concession of harvest. In Myanmar, the timber is harvested and then all piled up in an auction house together, nowhere near where it was harvested. So you can't even identify where your product came from. You will have lots of very attractive looking paperwork that looks very good, but you can't actually go down to the concession of harvest. So if you can't go down to the concession of harvest, you don't know where your timber came from, which is the biggest blocker to carrying out compliant due diligence. And if you believe that you bought it and it was already placed on the EU market before the regulation came in, or it was harvested before EUTR came in, then you would also need to evidence that. And I don't know how you can evidence when something was placed on a market when you can't tell me where it came from. But if I can't say never.
The European Union has published a position paper on Myanmar with a conclusion that it is not possible for any due diligence for Myanmar teak to be deemed as okay or in compliant with EUTR. Does the UKTR support this position paper as well?
Yes.
Okay, so that means perhaps the correct answer to this second question is number one for this moment, because it is not really possible for anyone to have in place a practical and compliant due diligence system. Is that right?
Yeah, again, I can't say it's impossible because someone might manage it, but
okay.
If I was in Myanmar, I wouldn't.
Yeah. So being able to speak slightly more freely. Yeah, I can't. It's what mitigation actions could you take to mitigate a corrupt legislature with military control of what harvesting goes on, fundamentally fraudulent documentation, and human rights abuses at all stages of the supply chain. What mitigation actions could you take in terms of sending in auditors to check it out, or tracking the timber from the origin, even if you can track precisely where it came from, and find a concession authorization to harvest that area? The issuing authority that issued the concession is evidenced as corrupt. So that negates the veracity of that evidence. So.
Thank you. And just one more from Krishna Sami. Is the restriction only applies to Myanmar, or a blanket ban on teak from anywhere? It is only on Myanmar, isn't it? There's no ban on teak particular.
No, there's plenty of plantation teak from other areas available.
Right, thank you. And then one more. In order to elaborate, okay, sorry. I'm a private forest owner in Germany. I can cut down my forest as I like, as long as I follow the forest code of my federate state. There are no harvest permits, etc. needed. There are also no reports of illegal logging in Germany. What kind of documentation does the sawmill I sell my round wood to have to provide to its customers in the UK? Do they need to provide proof that they bought the roundwood from me, such as invoices, or are there any other requirements?
So can I just clarify? There's no documents required to harvest timber in Germany, and there's no reports of illegal logging. So yes, so if you've done a risk assessment and you have established that Germany is low risk, then you are not required to go down to the concession, just the country of origin. But what you will need to do is evidence that that is the country of origin. So yes, a invoice from the forest to the sawmill would probably evidence that.
Thank you. That's very useful. Any other questions? Please just do submit them in the chat box. Now we have one from William. So Will said, who is competent authority for Northern Ireland? Should Northern Ireland operators be applying due diligence procedure under EUTR or UKTR or both?
So OPSS are the competent authority responsible for enforcing EUTR in Northern Ireland. So if you're importing into Northern Ireland, you must carry out due diligence in line with EUTR, although that's not very different from UKTR.
And for just one more from me then, for those who sell from GB to Northern Ireland, due diligence will also be required to be carried out by the operators in Northern Ireland, isn't it?
I'm just checking. I'm just trying to remember which way around the checks are. So if you're importing from Northern Ireland into GB, there are checks, and you have to carry out UKTR. If you are exporting from GB to Northern Ireland, there are no checks.
Okay. Thank you. Have I missed any other questions in the Q&A?
Yeah, there was one from earlier. I'm not seeing all the questions. I think they've probably been posted to TTF in the two part of the chat box, which I did myself earlier before someone flagged it up. But there was a question about India from Krishna Sami, who asked, I'm just going to quote the question. In terms of risk, where do you place India as a country in terms of importing tropical wood into the UK or the EU? I was just going to thought it'd be an opportunity to show the sourcing hub and how it works, and we'll just have a quick look at what the risks for India are. So shall I share screen?
I
think go through that. Deanne can mention the FAO bit possibly afterwards, which I think you
I think
rather than the sourcing hub. Shall I do this first? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably just worth saying that if I'm going to audit a business and I need to know what proves legality of harvest, the first place I would look at would be the Preferred by Nature website. And then the FAO website, I've not used much, which is why I kind of think we need to learn to use it just in case anything changes on other websites.
Okay, can I just confirm? Oh, great. Sorry, all my mouse appears to have taken this moment to stop working. Okay, can you see my my screen of the Preferred by Nature sourcing hub? I seem to have lost the pictures of the rest of you, but never mind. Okay, so here's the sourcing hub. There's an earlier page that allows you to choose timber. So if you choose timber, you get a global map appears. And then you hover over your country and it gives you an overview, which is, so India's got a risk score of 21 out of 100, so reasonably low, reasonably high risk, low number. There's four categories of low risk out of the 21 categories, with 15 specified risk. If you click on the country, you get a more detailed profile, again, a summary of that, a summary of the legality risks related to timber produced there. All of this work was funded by the UK. The mouse is dying. Battery powered mouse issues. Back to the pad. Okay, I'm now operating off the pad on my laptop, so bear with. This is going to be painful. So yeah, funded by UK aid and European money as well. So there's a risk assessment there you can click on, and you've got then 68 pages of Indian risk assessment, but there is a summary at the top. So I should scroll down to overview. It's an introduction about risk. There's the overview of the legality risks. So specified risk for 15 subcategories under the bigger areas of legal rights to harvest. For example, there's a non-recognition and violation of forest dwellers' rights. There's forest encroachment and illegal logging conducted on land not under the legal tenure of loggers due to, amongst other reasons, corruption amongst government officials, and sometimes timber harvesters without a permit or over-harvesting on permitted volumes. Worth flagging up, that's quite a common thing, is permitted concessions with, all of the documentation to show they're allowed to harvest there, but they haven't allowed harvest for that area, and sometimes they'll exceed that. Quite often as well, harvesting companies will go outside the boundaries of their concession area and take timber from surrounding areas as well. And these are some of the most more difficult to identify illegalities. You've got a number of things around taxes and fees not being paid, illegal harvesting within protected areas, corruption again, protected species, labour law violation, and then some others on trade and transport. So as you can see, for India, there's quite a lot of risks there. There's also a kind of definition of two particular source risk areas. So you have government and reserved and unclassified forests, which are managed under the more forest industry, forestry department commissions network, and then private plantations that do get permits from forest departments or the local kind of representative bodies. So it depends where the source of that material is. The private plantation stuff is often a lot of the kind of agroforestry timber, so things like mango wood and things come from those kind of origins generally, and risks are different in the two different types of forest origins. But for due diligence for material from India, you're going to want a lot of detail about the origin of this. where it's complex like this, and there's lots of potential cumulative and small risks, one of the best mitigation actions is actually talking to local kind of stakeholder groups on the ground. This is one of the key parts of the VPA process, is to use civil society to monitor the activities of timber harvesting and logging companies. And there may well be NGOs or local stakeholder groups operating in the area in which the timber is sourced, who can provide kind of mitigation actions on the ground, and say, oh, so and so this company is doing well, and we've talked to some local people about it, and they get paid fairly, and taxes get paid, etc. And others that don't. So multiple risks can potentially be mitigated by single action, by reaching out to those kind of organisations. But obviously that's a relatively high cost element potentially. So it all depends on the market size and market potential of the products you're looking at. So, I mean, if I'm working in procurement, for example, for a UK importer, and we're looking at a new product supply chain, all the costs of this kind of activity needs to be considered in the business case that's being put for taking on that new product supply.
Mm.
But that helps. I shall stop sharing unless Jamie wants to.
Yes, just one more, Andy. So someone asked, what should we go for? Where should we go for country risk guidance if NEPCOM has not carried out an assessment? There are other platforms.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, FSC's controlled wood national risk assessments. There might be one of those for that country. You have to search the document library on the FSC International website. If you go onto the FSC International website, there's a document library. If you search for, whatever nation state it is, controlled wood risk assessment, there might be one of those. They cover, I think, a few more countries than the sourcing hub does. If there isn't any of that, then you've got to go out and get primary evidence yourself, which might be challenging. Or there might not be anything because it's a relatively low risk country, and therefore quite straightforward.
If I could add, there are independent forest monitors in certain countries and local NGOs. Perhaps that is another source you could contact to ask for further information. Yeah, so NGO stakeholders, etc. And if you need any help, do get in touch with TTF, with us, because maybe we can then help you to reach the right contact in that country as well. Right, and here I received another question, and this is questions for Deanne. So Deanne, could you let us know, if you are to enforce a company, what is the procedure? What will you ask to see from this company?
We'll ask to see the due diligence system for a specific import. So whether we use UK trade info or HMRC data, we will identify an import made on a specific date, and we'll ask for so we'll know roughly the date and the commodity code, and then we'll ask to see the due diligence that's been applied to that import.
Okay. And this one, another one, sorry, this is from me, just to follow up. Evidence of due diligence, because OPSS has also published a checklist or template for due diligence. Yeah. Is that going to be a mandatory, or what are the rules around?
We found that when we visited a lot of businesses, they didn't actually know what due diligence was. So how could they even start to do due diligence? So we made that tool. It's a very basic tool, probably only suitable for very simple supply chains, but it includes all of the obligations that you should have carried out and be able to evidence. So if you can answer all those questions and evidence it, then you hopefully should be compliant.
I will also share a link to that too, but it is similar to what Sonia has already presented.
Very similar.
Right, thank you. Oh, and here we have one more, also from friends. So how are composite products from low-risk countries handled? For example, a German producer of particle boards who buys from hundreds of sources within Germany, but no inputs from other countries. Is proof of all potential sources needed, or how should this be handled? It is an exemplary supply chain sufficient?
So it is an exemplary. So the first thing you have to do is risk assess Germany as a country, and then you need to, and if your risk assessment comes out as low risk, then you only need to go to country of origin, not concession. But what you do need to do is evidence that the products do come from that country and not some of them and others. So particle board, you're going to have a complex supply chain, I imagine. So you will need to, your country of origin might be low risk, but the complexity of supply chain is going to be high risk. So you're going to have to make that balance in between. So you may only be required to go down to country of harvest for origin, but you are going to need to prove that all of the components come from that country. And you're still going to need to prove legality of harvest, depending on what German's national laws say.
You know what I'd add to that, if there's a particle board manufacturer in Germany, I would thought it's very likely to be certified. A part of that certification will include a complete suppliers list of everyone supplying them, which could be very useful evidence for you that everything's coming from within a set geographical area. And also, I would suspect that they will get stuff from neighbouring countries as well, and probably quite a lot of recycled products and stuff as well, and something like that. But that, you know, that could produce, you know, that could be an evidence source, part of their chain of custody audit report, showing that the list of suppliers has been audited by a third party, for example. Could be really useful if they let you have that.
If I could follow up from this question, if sometimes for certain type of products such as CLT, it may not be possible to identify that this particular batch of CLT is made of timber from within this Germany. The timber could come from a range of different countries within Europe, and it's just impossible to trace the product back to the precise country. But a list of possible countries available, will that be okay?
No. No. A country of origin is a requirement. We will sometimes, where there's a lot of species in a product and that's all coming from the same forest, say this product will contain one of these 10 species, but I don't think you can lower that to countries. This product comes from one of all of the countries on this planet, or even all of the countries within the EU. Is not, countries have different risks, so therefore you cannot lump them all into the same category.
If I could add, it would be feasible for a small, you know, a mill in southern Germany to be getting material from northern Italy, Austria, Germany, maybe Czech Republic, all low risk, all common risk criteria, all with a potential supplier list for that mill, showing the companies that they're buying it from and potential evidence about their supply base, the geographical area over which they are getting their supplies. If it's something like particle board product, that's a really low value product. You don't bring it a long way because the cost of transport are probably half the value of that product. You can evidence all of that.
Yeah,
so
you can't just say my product.
That. But yeah, some of it was Russia and some of it was, and then it throws the whole thing upside down.
What you've just described is something very different than saying my timber might come from Italy, Germany, or Czech Republic. What you've just described, you're evidencing those things. So yes, yeah.
Evidence a whole lot.
Yeah.
But each particular piece of plant could be one or the other.
Yeah. Yes, I buy from these 10 sawmills, and these 10 sawmills obtain their timber from these 50 forests. That's probably a little bit big. That's probably too high numbers, but that sort of thing.
No, there's plenty of that scale. But defined supply base is what's used within the kind of FSC controlled wood stuff as a definitions of areas and how that's controlled.
If you can evidence to me that the risk is low enough, then, and I agree with your conclusion.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. I think that answered all of the questions here in the Q&A. Excuse me. And we are perfectly on time. Well done, everybody. Thank you. Thank you so much, Diane. The next session will be a quick group discussion led by Andy, Sonia, and Sam. And then after that, we will have a UPM, Joanne, joining us to share a little bit about what is happening in Finland and how Joanne is carrying out due diligence for timber produced in Finland to their UK clients. Right, thank you. And then I hand the floor to Andy, Sam, and Sonia. Thanks again, Diane.
Thank you.
Thanks, Diane.
Thank you.
Okay, essentially what we're trying to replicate here is something we've done, and Diane's seen it before, and so Zhao, is to basically have small kind of breakout groups, and we do this kind of event physically and break people up into groups of 6 or 7 on a table and give them a potential timber supply scenario and say, here you go, talk about the risks and potential mitigations around that. We had such good attendance at the event today. We've still got 65 out of original 77. So the words due diligence being used about 300 times so far have only driven 12 people away, which I'm pretty impressed by. But equally, we know we've got a pretty knowledgeable kind of cohort of attendees. So I'm not sure how well this will work. We're going to give it a go. The breakout rooms didn't feel like they were going to work. We're going to kind of basically share a Word document on screen which describes a scenario in a source country, and then we're going to ask, and then we'll essentially there'll be an open floor to suggestions about what the company needs to do in that situation. So I don't know, and I'm open for suggestions from Zhao. Should we allow people to respond through the chat? Or shall we say, put your hand up and you can make some input and we get a bit of back and forth? How would you like to play this? Which is very experimental. This may be a disaster.
Yeah, let's try both. So let's display the question. Okay. And then we can easily just unmute anyone who wish to just raise their hand and then wish to engage. So please do.
Respond in the chat or stick your hand up. If you're in the chat, please address it to everyone, because otherwise I won't see it, and we'll rely on Zhao reading it out, although that won't matter too much. I'll read this out. This was the most kind of open of our scenarios. We had about 6. So it's specific to a certain supply chain, but it has the most kind of open kind of question at the end of it. So hopefully it can garner a response and some engagement. So we're looking at furniture from Vietnam. You're an experienced procurement specialist and have been engaged by Wood Furniture World to work with their suppliers in Vietnam. There are 25 suppliers you have contracts with, producing 50 different products, all made with solid hardwood timber. 10 suppliers are FSC certified and the others are not. You have a consultant employed in Vietnam who visits the suppliers to make quality checks for you. He says that there's 60 production locations, but he has it all in hand. Wood Furniture World have just been featured in the WWF's Timber Scorecard and came bottom in the sector for transparency and proportion of certified products. The competent authority have just announced they're going to have a campaign on the furniture sector in the next 12 months. You've found a dusty folder in the office called UKTR Due Diligence with a section for 20 of the 25 suppliers. Each section has a template form included, signed by the MD of each company, stating that they fully comply with due diligence requirements and only buy from low-risk sources. The folders also have copies of FSC certificates from some of the companies and a selection of partly redacted transaction documents in Vietnamese. What should you do? So there's quite a few things that could come on here. I'm going to pull up the chat so I can see if anyone's going to dive in. Anyone suggest where you would start in that situation? We've had a bit of a hospital pass if we're playing football, to be fair. But, a number of actions that could be taken. First of all, when was the last country assessment made? Yeah, find some assessments of the of Vietnam, some national risk assessments of the country to inform your process. That's from Simon. And look at it and see how that affects your suppliers and what they get. But what do you really need to know? So the first stage in due diligence is to know where everything's coming from. So yeah, Joe Johnston says a list of current suppliers. yeah, put all the files in order and check the expiry dates of the FSC certificates. Very good. Start from scratch, full supply chain mapping. Jane wins the gold star. That's where you start. Try and assess the consultants. You know, have they got conflict of interest? Are they being given backhand as much from the companies? You know, how come it's coming from 60 locations, but there's only 25 contracts? Pin the dusty folder. Probably a fair start. You know, there might be something in there that's worth it. Maybe the name of the MDs of each company might be useful information for a start. But yeah, so map that supply chain. So build a nice big Excel spreadsheet with squares on it for each one, for each of those suppliers. Translate documents into English. Very good. Stuart, source elsewhere. Yes, indeed. Head to the Chilterns and start furniture. Check the scope of certificates to check that the products are in scope. Very good. Gather as much information as possible and validate any existing evidence is up to date. Craig, absolutely. So, you know, currency is important, but I don't mean financial. How recent documents are. You know, due diligence has to be conducted annually, so it needs to be refreshed anyway. So old stuff won't be too useful. From Julia, list the suppliers, map the supply chains, gather information on those supply chains and the relevant documentation, and do a full DDS check on everything. So yes, very good. I think, you know, you've got someone in country here. That's a useful start. That person could, for example, you could get them to do. They could be trained to conduct audits of the suppliers. So you're actually getting, although it isn't a third-party audit, you can have a systematic audit that's first party because they're an employee of yours, or second party because they're actually auditing your suppliers. But you can collect useful information like that, and you can evidence, you know, random sampling of their supply chain documentation and things like that. So you could implement an audit program within the country using your consultant in country. For example, that's always quite strong mitigation evidence. Yeah, or indeed, Julie says, employing on the ground auditing company, third party one, to do some field-based checks of the suppliers and see where they're coming from, see where the material's coming from. Very good. Excellent. So, so Darren uses the preferred by nature template, which allows them to request all the basic information of the timber origins to start off with, and then obtain the documented supporting evidence, create a risk assessment based on the desktop information, then either visit or audit them yourself, or use third-party auditing bodies, and carry out isotopic testing. Very good. You know, I'm not sure where the World Timber ID project is at the minute in terms of mapping log origin in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, but I'm sure it's one of their target areas. It's something I could do with being updated with. So if anyone on the call knows how they're getting on with that area of the world, isotopic testing, which we'll hear about tomorrow, can evidence very clearly if material has been harvested from a location other than that which is claimed. Excellent. Well, if the consultant is competent, says Olivier, I will ask him to audit all suppliers and verify all of the sources of supply. If the products are not certified, the chain of custody provides a little guarantee. Absolutely right. I mean, as we referred to earlier, quite commonly when we look at due diligence from companies, a certificate, actually having a certificate is considered as some form of mitigation. And as Sonia said earlier, it isn't. It's a product certification. And the product invoice needs to have certified status on it to state that the product's certified. Certification is irrelevant otherwise. But we very commonly see people waving certificates essentially at us, saying, look, they're certified. But if the product isn't, it's not worth anything. Excellent. Well, I think we've covered quite a lot there. We do have a knowledgeable kind of set here. So between everybody, we can see what needs doing in that situation. I think, you know, the furniture sector as a whole is one that I think has been slightly behind others in the field of certification and supply chain assurance as overall. And I think I feel that increasing pressure will apply to the furniture sector to kind of clean that up a bit. I hope there's no big furniture importers feeling offended by what I just said. Okay, and we've still only lost a couple of other participants. How are we thinking, Zhao? Do you want to try and do another one? We could, if you
could
can create.
Do the one. Oh, shall we do a poll question here? We do have one that might.
Oh, you've got a poll up your
This
sleeve.
one.
It's all going freeform now, people.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, Sam, do you want to drop the share of the furniture one, please? Sorry, I've got Sam sharing everything.
Okay, right, let's do one more poll. And then if we have more time, let's do another scenario, Andy.
Sounds good. And I'll let someone else choose it, and I'll let Sam also.
Right. Get ready, everyone. Here it is. Here is the question. Hope it makes sense. So let's get wait a few more seconds. Oh, fantastic. Right, let's count to 5 and then we will stop. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Excellent. Thank you, everybody. Let's end the poll now. And then here is the result. Right, so we import oak flooring from Asia. So oak is declared to be originated from France. So wood anatomy, am I pronouncing that word correctly? Or DNA testing is needed to verify that the species is really oak, or isotopic testing is needed to check if oak really come from France, or both A and B are not relevant to this product. So we have 4 people have selected that A and B are not relevant to this product. So what should be the right answer here, Andy?
Okay, I don't know, what does Sam or Sonia want to jump in and cover the whole world of oak? You heard enough of my voice.
I was just going to say a kind of brief answer is, in the context of due diligence, it will relate to what risks you want to mitigate or assess. So if you have identified a risk that what you're being sent claiming to be from France might not be from France, then you're probably more interested in isotope testing. If that's not a risk that you've identified, or you've made yourself confident that that risk doesn't exist, then you probably don't need to do that testing.
Great, thank you, Sonia. Would you like to add anything?
Yes, so I guess specifically this question targets, so sorry, I got out of the habit of speaking for an hour and I can't find my voice. You may have come across the case of one of the most kind of famous and biggest prosecutions for illegal timber importing was in the US against a company called Lumber Liquidators. And this kind of case study pretty much originates from that prosecution, where it was found that the company knowledgeably purchased oak products from China, which were said to be of American or European origin, but were actually CITES listed Mongolian oak harvested in Russia and then illegally traded over the border without a CITES permit. So the specific risk in this case, because you're not buying the product from France, you're buying it from a country which is closely located to this source of riskier source of that species. the risk that you have within that product is that it's not coming from France. So therefore, and if you do kind of any research around oak, you would likely come across this case. So you should hopefully, from all the publicly available information out there, be able to identify that this is the risk you need to mitigate. And therefore the test which is appropriate is the isotopic testing, which will tell you exactly where that timber comes from.
If I can add one thing, so the TTF also ran a oak flooring test 2 years ago before the pandemic, where we collected oak flooring samples from companies, and we sent them to the lab to verify whether the origin of oak, because all the origins of the oak were declared to be from Europe, so European oak flooring. So we have them tested, and the result came as, from top of my head, I think it's 4% or 4 companies, sorry, 4 out of 20 something companies. The samples from those 4 companies came to be not true. So the origin claimed is not, well, the result shows that it is not the claimed origin as it is. It doesn't mean that they were illegal. It just perhaps to do with an error made in the declaration, or it was declared to be France, but actually it is more likely to be not France, but another European country. But anyhow, that shows the inconsistency in the operator's due diligence.
Yeah, just to reinforce what you just said, Joe, I can't shut up. Is the isotopic testing tests the declared location. So you'd say this is from France, test it, and it'll tell you whether or not it's from France. Depending on it operates because it has a reference set of samples against which it compares things and compares the sample that they're given. So, and the kind of granularity of that reference set varies in different places. So, you know, as my most recent knowledge of it is that the France example is pretty broad. So actually, European would be more of a test of it, and telling French from German would be quite difficult because there's not a lot of variation in the soil that the trees are growing from, which is where the isotopes come from that are in the tree. So actually, you probably be pretty clear that actually it's not European oak, and if it isn't, then it's either American or it's East Asian. But the one other thing I wanted to add was around wood anatomy and DNA testing for the timber species nerds out there, of which I'm sure there's plenty on the call, and I'm one. That European oak, Quercus robur, and Mongolian oak, Quercus mongolica, and the range of American white and red oaks are different species, but are incredibly hard to tell apart by wood anatomy and DNA testing. I mean, one, DNA testing needs a very good sample of solid wood and stuff that's been converted potentially down to veneer level, and things can be quite hard to get a workable sample for. And at wood anatomy level, it's almost impossible to tell between European oak and Mongolian oak. So where there is theoretically a possibility of telling them apart on that species or subspecies basis, it doesn't have the same level of reliability as using the isotope thing to determine origin. Nerd bit over.
Thank you, Andy. Just one more question. I think we do have some time left. There's one more question in the Q&A. So this one is from Neil. Some suppliers in Europe seem reluctant to give forest locations. What is the best way to influence them in people's experiences? I think we can maybe open the floor as well. Anyone want to jump in? What are your experiences so far? How have you been communicating with your supplier in Europe to get them engaged or willing to, or be able to provide you with the information that you need? Any tips? What do you think, Sonia, Sam, Andy, in this as well?
Darren said persistence, which is probably about that. I was going to say just quickly, from our perspective as somebody who looks at this, you know, as auditors, and I'm sure from the OPSS's perspective, the ultimate conclusion, if you can't complete your due diligence and satisfy yourself that that purchase meets the UKTR, is that you don't buy it. So obviously that's not a great conclusion for anyone in some situations, but it would ultimately be the conclusion if you can't get the information you need. But yeah, I'd be very interested to hear what everybody else says, because I know that there'll be lots of companies in this situation.
So we will be hearing from Joanne in a moment about Joanne's experience working with both UK clients and maybe some other European suppliers as well in terms of meeting due diligence requirements under UKTR. Right, perfect. Thank you, anybody. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Andy, Sam, Sonia. I think we are about on time. Shall we just propose maybe have a 3 minutes toilet and tea break before Joanne starts her presentation? Is that okay? Hello, Joanne. Thank you.
Hi.
So maybe let's aim to come back at 1:30, so 1:30. Ready for Joanne. Thank you so much. See you in a moment. Right. Hi, Joanne.
Hi.
Do you want to put up the slide? Just try.
Sorry, say that again.
You want to sharing
So
stuff?
do you want to try it now? Yeah.
Yes, try it now. Yep. And Peter Ball says, hello, Joanne.
Hey, hi, Peter. Oh, all right.
Oops, we are fantastic. Now it works.
Yeah, hang on. Let's just get to. Oh, I've got to do it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now I've got to display settings.
Yep.
Hang on, I'm just doing display settings.
I'll try to supply you with
Yeah, bear with me. I'm trying to get it onto the.
No, that's okay.
Oh, that's it.
Yes, that's the one.
So slow. I'm so sorry.
No, it's okay. We still have 3 minutes. I'm also going to to take a break in a second.
Okay.
I think okay, right. Now turn off my camera. I'll be back with you in 2 minutes.
Okay.
Ready. Right, let's give it a few more seconds. Right, hopefully everybody by now will come back. Fantastic, thank you. And thank you, Joanne. So would you like just to maybe introduce yourself a little bit and then let's start. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm Joan Bailey from UPM Plywood. I'm the sales manager for UK and Ireland. We do have environmental managers in Finland, but obviously I just look after the UK part of the business and any environmental questions that we get. So I just wanted to show you going through our system, because up until obviously Brexit, most of our customers were traders under the EUTR and now becoming importers because they're now importing directly from Europe. So I wanted to show you the Finnish system that we operate in, starting with supply chain. And this is the actual snapshot of the Finnish forest industry. So from the original forest, we get the logs, which we use for sawmilling and also for plywood production. So that would take a certain part of the log. Smaller parts of the log and also thinnings would go to pulpwood production. And then the bark from the forest and also some stumps would go towards the biomass energy to run the factories. And then coming back from the mechanical industry, the wood waste and the chips goes into the chemical industry and also to produce pulp as well. So it's quite an integrated system. And so this is a basic supply chain going into the mill production. So we've got the existing forest, then it's harvested and measured. It then transfers to a truck. If it's a local forest, it would be transported to the mill by the truck. But if it's further away, it could be on a train or it could be by a boat, or we still use floating methods. For very long distances, we can use floating along the lake systems. So from there, it gets to the mill gate. So again, it's remeasured when it gets to the mill gate to make sure we've got the right quantity that we've actually purchased. It could also go to some storage terminal. So again, it would be checked there and then again onto the mill gate. And then once it gets to the mill site, it goes into the wood storage area. And again, it's all measured there. And then eventually it makes its way into production. This is a bit more complicated supply chain map showing pulp production, which is worth looking at because again, we've got the existing forest, and depending on where the forest is, it depends what method we use to get the wood to the actual producing mills. So local supply logs, again, go by truck to the sawmills and plywood mills. The pulpwood goes by truck if it's local. These further away forests, we would then transport it by train and vessel. And then we also supply the further away forests, we would supply local businesses there, and it could be a government run business or local businesses there, we use that. And then back from these companies, we then have the chips and the pulpwood, again, that we transfer back to the UPM pulp mills. So we've got a very long supply chain there for the products. But how does this actually work in reality? So the first question, is it possible for UPM to trace back its timber to the forest concession in Finland? The answer is yes. So when the wood arrives at the mill site, an ultimate receipt is made. And at this stage, the timber can be traced back to the forest. And at the end of the presentation, I'll give you show you a set of documents that shows you the trail from the forest right through to the mill gate. But once we get into the factory, the logs are then mixed in production, so they cannot be traced back to the forest anymore after they get put into production. And this is just a sample slide because I will show you the documents later, but from the original map of where the forest is, so we've got some forest sites here, and this is the GPS map, and this would be in the harvester's cab, and he knows exactly what he's going to harvest. And then at the end of the line, this is the receipt of the logs being loaded onto the transport to go to the mill. And then this little box here is just showing the receipt of the logs at the mill. So all along the line, we've got these traceability. So there you've got the delivery ticket number there, and it's on our receipt number there. So we've got this traceability all the way through, which I'll show you later. So what documents are needed to prove that the harvesting in the original forest is legal? And can we get these documents? So we've come up with a set of documents that would be needed to prove legality. So original is a stumpage contract, and that is the contract we have with the forest owner. And that would outline the types of trees that we're going to harvest, and expected volumes and prices. The next legal document would be the notification to the local forest authority to show what we're going to harvest and get their approval for it. The next contract is with the actual company that's going to do the harvesting. And again, that's given a list of what they're going to do. After they've harvested, we then have a measurement certificate, and that gives the actual outcome of the actual harvesting. And that includes everything that comes out of that forest. And then the next document is the transportation from the forest to the mill. And then again, like I said, the acknowledgement from the mill of what's been received, and that's measured again at the mill. And we've got access to all these documents, which we can provide. So the question is, what are the possible risks for timber illegality in Finland, if any at all? Well, UPM, we have our own wood supplier, which is UPM Forest. So all our wood products are purchased from UPM Forest, and this is how they actually ensure the legality of the wood. So we source our wood from our own forest and also from private forest owners, and that could be individuals like you and I, just probably got about 20 hectares of forest that we've had in the family a long while, and UPM has over 20,000 contracts a year for wood procurement, so it's quite a detailed business. And there's also from business to business partners, which could be government-owned land and forest and other forest industries companies. So all the wood we use is 100% traceable. And we do not source wood from protected areas or from areas where the rights of Indigenous people are threatened. So again, talking about the Sami reindeer herders, and there's also this old growth forests that are protected. So obviously the mapping enables us to select the right forests. And our suppliers are required to comply with responsible business practices specified under the UPM supplier and third-party code, and our company policies and rules. And the specific criteria for wood sourcing is defined in our UPM requirements for wood supplies. So we have a code of practice that they need to follow. And we also use and promote recognised forest certification schemes such as FSC and PFC. And we don't favour either one, it's at the customer's choice as well. And also where we got actually the originating forest as PFC or FSC. And we use certified chain of custody and control wood systems. And they're verified by independent external auditors to ensure that our wood is 100% responsibly sourced. So messages to the UK importers. The question we've had, is it necessary to disclose all the info to the UK customer to provide low risk of illegal logging in Finland? Well, basically it's the operator's responsibility to exercise due diligence. The information gathering and the risk assessment, whether it's negligible risk or non-negligible risk, which is obviously the risk mitigation stage. And the operator is the person who first places timber in the UK market, so it's their responsibility. But if the documents they need contain names of the forest owners, etc., then we would need the customer to sign a non-disclosure agreement, because we have to protect the privacy of the owners under the GDPR regulations. So we need that before we can actually provide certain documents if the customer needs to go back to that level of due diligence. So realistically, the documents that the UK importer should be requesting or checking is the list of documents that I've already itemised earlier in the presentation, which I'll go through with you. And how does UPM use FFC and PFC, and how do we demonstrate our product as valid certification? When the product is sold, it has PFC or FFC phrases in the order confirmations and the invoices and also delivery documents. And then all our certified products are labelled with the certification scheme, whether it's PFC or FFC. And just some basic tips on conducting due diligence. We'd recommend having an environmental manager, even if it's not a full-time job. It's very good to have somebody responsible for the actual process. And you know, you need a supply chain map and all the documents checked. And we've already mapped and checked the supply chain to ensure that we have the relevant documentation available for your UK importers, so that they can complete the due diligence. And the other question was, in order to conclude the product as an eligible risk, what minimum info documentation UPM must have? It's all the relevant documents of the chain proving that the wood is supplied is according to the applicable legislation. So you need a full set of documents to actually prove it. And then also we've got the use of FSC and PFC, which helps in the risk mitigation. And talking about challenges that we found, it's been quite what we've been trying to work out what information is needed. So find out what each customer needs for their own particular due diligence scheme. And that is why we're trying to put together a simple set of documents and certificates to cover the supply chain. And we're not sure of the level of detail that may be required. For example, we have names and contacts of the forest owners, but we could not divulge those, like I've already said. So it's knowing actually what the UK customers need. We have got full sets of documentation available. And then for the UK customers to understand that it's only the operators that are obligated to gather the information on the wood chains. If a customer is buying from UK landed stock, then they are still a trader. So it's only on the items that you're importing directly from Europe that you would need to have due diligence on. So as a trader, you're just maintaining the records and identifying the operator or the trader who supplied the product. That's the end of that present. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, of course. Yes.
Are you planning, or are you already operating a UK subsidiary of UPM as an invoicing point and as the official operator into the market?
No. It's UPM does it from Finland, but we are registered for VAT.
Okay.
I'm just going to stop sharing my screen because I'm going to show you the documents.
It's okay. Take your time.
Sorry, I have to take my time because
okay.
it's not easy with Zoom. I've never done Zoom presentation before, so
I have two
apologize.
monitors. It's very confusing sometimes. Don't worry.
Exactly. Right, so I need to get back to sharing the screen now. Let's hope that works.
And we are very on time, so take your time.
Yeah, well, I'm very quick. Right, I need to get you back. Share screen.
Yes, well done.
Excellent. Oh, and I just need to. Is that okay as it is, or do you need me to?
No, it's very clear. Yes.
Okay. Right. So I'm just going to run through these documents I was talking about, and as I said earlier, we cannot take a specific order and trace it right back to the forest, but obviously we know from when the order was produced, roughly, you know, that we can trace it from that aspect of it. So this is an example of some spruce logs being delivered to our Pelos spruce plywood mill, and it was for production between October 2020 and March 2021. So, and all importantly, this is the stumpage contract I was talking about, which we have with the forest owner, and this is its contract number. And this is the initial contract, and it will have on it the expected wood that we're going to take from the forest. So in Finland, they're all mixed forests. They're not plantations. So you get a mix of spruce logs, birch logs. Also, there can be some aspen in there. So it's all the natural woods of the forest. And then obviously when they replant birch and spruce log mix as well. So And it's also showing, let's just go down a bit, this price groupings, let's clear cutting and then other thinnings. So this is a good demonstration of sustainable forestry, because obviously we are taking out some clear cutting, but then there's a lot of maintenance to do, getting the thinnings out of the way and cutting some lower branches off. So again, all this is valuable wood, which can be used in production, but also it's actually maintaining the forest and keeping it very, very healthy. So then we start looking at the map of where the wood is going to come from. So this is a general map of Finland, and this purple line here is the border with Russia. So you can see that the location of this particular forest is eastern Finland and in the lake system. And then this is just more of a closer map. So again, you can actually pinpoint it. And then finally, this is the GPS map, which the harvester will have in his cab. And we're looking at this forest here called Tunala, so it's just here. I'm not sure you can see it, but it actually says PFC on it. So that is the forest where we're going to harvest from today. So the next thing is we need to get confirmation from the local authority to get the permission to actually harvest the forest. So you can see this is their confirmation. So there's more areas on it, but this is this Tunala forest at the bottom. It's listed as 100% PFC, and it says when it's going to start. That's when we applied for it. That's when we got confirmation, and it expires in 2023. So we can harvest that when we wish, as long as it's not after that time. So the next thing we have to do is have the contract with the harvesting company and forwarding company. Again, we've got this stumpage contract number here, which is featured, and it gives the name of the company who's actually going to do the harvesting for us. And we've got some translations here. Moto is harvesting and felling the trees, and then they're also going to forward it to the roadside. So they're harvesting, and then they transport it through the forest to the roadside for us to take it away on a vehicle. And again, it's got times when he's going to do it and when it's going to end. So, and it's also got the name of the person who's going to do it. So it's very detailed. So after they've done the harvesting, we then get this complete contract of what they've actually harvested, and it's actually they've produced a lot more than was the original contract. So this is obviously why it's very important. So the forest owner gets the maximum amount for the wood that is sold. So again, we've got this contract number here, and it goes through very detailed of what actually has come out of that forest. So lots of thinnings as well. So again, we're just highlighting the spruce logs which you're going to take to the mill, because for plywood we use the bigger logs, and then other parts of the tree are used for different things, and smaller logs are used for pulpwood. So it just depends what comes out of the forest. So that's been cut, and the harvesting company has put it to the roadside. So then it's then transported by the transport company. So again, he's got the stumpage contract number on his. This is all computerized, obviously, but it's the stumpage contract number, and then the ticket number of the delivery ticket. And then we finally get this to the mill. And again, it's got the delivery ticket number there, and we measure the wood again to make sure exactly as it should be on the delivery note. And then it's referring to this contract number here. So that, yeah, and I've got other examples, but I just wanted to show you that. So that is what we've deemed as legal documentation, if that's what's needed by the customers. So I'll stop sharing now if anybody's got any comments.
Thank you so much, John. This is
that was just a quick run through anyway. So
this is also the first time for me to understand the actual document and what does the document look like for Finland. I don't know if anyone have any questions for Joanne or questions on Finland that you would like to ask. Please feel free to raise your hand, and I will just unmute you if that is more convenient. we have, oh, that's Peter.
Yeah.
Hi, Joan.
Hi, Peter.
Have you had much resistance from UK customers in terms of working as operators, or are they quite happy to be operators?
I think the thing is they're operators with other parts of the world.
Yeah.
So I think they already are operators, but obviously now Europe, they've become an operator within Europe as well. So a lot of customers, it's not new to them to be an operator, not our customers anyway. So it's just another extra workload, isn't it?
Okay, thank you.
So I've had no resistance because they're already operators on other products.
Because of the scale they're on.
Yeah, it could be from South America or China.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you. And Philippa, would you like to?
Hi, Joanne. Thank you for
Hi,
the
Philippa.
presentation.
Quick run through.
Do the documents always come in English? And do you find the process complicated, or is it simple to go through the due
Well,
diligence?
I'm going to confess to you, Philippa, because our environmental manager in Finland, she does the translating, so everything is in Finnish. So we would translate for the customers the documents. So I personally don't have to do that. But yes, we do translate, and that would be the same for Russia as well. We would translate if what's needed. So.
Okay, thank you.
Like I presented there, we just give the English words for the Finnish words. It's probably an easier way to do it like that as well. So. I must admit, I went through this process myself, and I didn't realise that we would have all those documents available. But we're doing that every day, so it's just normal for us to do it, and then it's just a matter of providing the correct documents for the customer.
Yes.
So they're part of the business.
Thank you, Joanne. Thank you, Philippa. And a question from me, Joanne. I mean, one of the challenges you mentioned there is that some of your UK clients, they themselves are not maybe too aware of what exactly they need to acquire or what to do under UKTR. So how have you been trying to work with your UK clients to explain to them, I mean, what are expected of them?
Well, we try to steer them, to help them, and Finland's a low risk country anyway, so and we've got FSC and PFC, so then we give examples of the documentation to help them. So we've got documentation examples for every mill, so whatever mill the customer buys from, we say, right, this is the example of the documentation we can give. And so far that has been okay. So even if they're not so sure themselves, we can make the process easy. So you don't have to be an expert. Like, I'm not an expert, but I've got a really, really good understanding just from doing this process for this meeting, really. So, we can guide our customers because we have got all the information available. And if somebody wants something extra, that's fine. We will find it. But we think the documentation set there is what's needed for legality requirements. And we will guide people. So
thank you. I think that's very helpful because from my observation, even though UKTR has been now in place for almost 11 months, but I think we're all on this learning curve. So I mean, your sharing has been very helpful, and hopefully we would be able to do more similar to invite companies to do more sharings in the future.
Well, yeah, hopefully it will encourage people, and I do think we feel lucky because we have got all this information available. And when you were showing that scenario from Vietnam, my response was get another supplier because it just looks so complicated compared to what obviously we can do in Finland. So I do feel sorry for people who've got these really complicated supply chains. It looks like a nightmare.
It is. Right. Thank you again, Joanne.
You're very welcome.
Thank you so much. I think that we don't have any other questions in the chat box. And fantastic. So Joanne's presentation concludes our training day 1. Thank you. Any other notes, Andy, Sonia, Sam, that you want to add for today?
Just thanks for being here. Yep, same again.
Yeah, thanks for a lot of very knowledgeable attendees who provided some useful insights themselves. And it's been a pleasure to hand over and to get back on it. I was doing this kind of thing quite regularly until a couple of years ago when something happened. So it's quite nice to get back on talking about it. Although with the challenges of UKTR being difficult, maybe there'll be a little bit more cross acceptance and cross compliance in future. But I think there's some pretty delicate and tender relationships between the UK and the EU at the moment, isn't there?
Yeah.
And we're all victims of it.
But hopefully we can all help each other and learn and improve due diligence, because there can never be any perfect system. So hopefully we can, all learn together.
Although, I mean, I think what Joan has just shown us with UPM and their whole integrated traceability system, I mean, Sam and I were just discussing it offline, and the fact you know where everything is all of the time, and that kind of complete monitoring is all eminently doable now. And handheld devices can record where material is and where material's felled. And the leading companies that are harvesting sustainably and legally in Amazonia and in South America and stuff are tagging logs. They're high value, they're worth tagging individually, they can be tracked from one place to another. You can know where everything is at every stage. And technology is the answer to all of this. And the illegal stuff is always going to struggle to get into that kind of entire technological network. And I know that FSC they understand there are real issues with fraud in FSC supply chains, and they're looking at, one end to the other, blockchain solutions and, systematic origin testing as ways of kind of mitigating risks in their supply chains. So I think the answer is technology across the whole piece. Although I won't be the one operating that. It was only halfway through Joan's presentation that I found the Q&A box. Been looking in the chat all the time and haven't found that tool. So I'm even worse on Zoom than you, Joan. So I know technology is the answer, but I think I'll be on the riverbank with the fishing rod in my hand. My version of the golf course behind.
Thank you, Andy. And just a note quickly for tomorrow. Tomorrow we will have another full day, another full 4 hours, and we will be hearing from 4 more companies sharing their experience of due diligence on Brazil, Russia, Africa, and Europe again, and as well as we will be learning from our friends at Open Timber Portal. I can see them here already, Oliver, Marco, and Murray, to give a presentation on what is happening in Congo Basin and what is Open Timber Portal, how the portal can help importers here in the UK and Europe to mitigate their risks of sourcing from the Congo Basin. And we will also be hearing from speakers at ESO Lab, the UK-based species testing and isotopic testing lab, who will explain to us everything about species testing tomorrow. So once again, thank you for everybody for your time staying with us today. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye. Thank you, Joanne.
Okay, bye.
Sam.
Bye.
Bye all. Thanks so much.
Bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.